They told me never to fly beyond Antarctica. But what I saw changed my life forever. True story. Okay, before I start, do me a favor. Comment where you're listening to this from. Your car, your bedroom, wherever. Just let me know someone's out there hearing this because, honestly, I don't know how much time I have left. My name is Daniel Foster. People used to call me Dan. I was a captain in the U.S. Air Force for 16 years, flew cargo missions to some of the most remote places on Earth. And for the last 3 years, I've been living like a ghost in the middle of nowhere, northern Canada. No phone, no internet until recently. No contact with anyone from my old life. And before you think I'm some paranoid crazy person hiding in the woods, 3 days ago, I saw a drone. Not a normal civilian drone, but military-grade surveillance equipment flying grid patterns over this area. They're looking for me again, which means I need to tell you what I saw in Antarctica before they find me and make sure this story dies with me. I'm recording this from a cabin about 200 miles north of Yellowknife, in a region so remote that the nearest human being is probably 50 miles away. I bought this place with cash back in 2022, right after I ran. No paper trail, no deed in my name, just a handshake deal with a guy who didn't ask questions and didn't want answers. For 3 years, I've lived off the grid. Solar panels I installed myself. Water from a well I dug by hand. Food from hunting and supplies I buy once every few months from a trading post where nobody knows my real name. It's been lonely as hell, if I'm being honest. I've had more conversations with the wolves that pass through here than with actual people. But it's kept me alive. Kept me hidden from the people who want to make sure what I saw in December 2021 never becomes public knowledge. I thought I was safe here. I thought maybe they'd given up looking for me. Decided I wasn't worth the resources to track down. But that drone, that changed everything. The cabin's got one room, a wood stove that barely keeps the place warm when it hits -40, and a sleeping bag I've been using for so long it's more duct tape than fabric at this point. I'm looking at it right now, and honestly, it's depressing as hell compared to the life I used to have. I had an apartment in Colorado Springs, a decent truck, friends I'd grab beers with on weekends, normal stuff, simple stuff, and I threw it all away because I couldn't keep my mouth shut about what I discovered. See, when you witness something that fundamentally changes your understanding of reality, something that proves we're not alone in this universe, and that our governments have been lying to us for decades, it's hard to just go back to watching football and pretending everything's normal. I tried. God knows I tried for about 6 months after they let me go. But eventually, I started asking questions, started making calls to people I thought I could trust. That's when the surveillance started. That's when I realized staying in civilization meant disappearing permanently. 3 days ago, I was checking my trapline about a mile from the cabin when I heard it. That distinct buzzing sound that small aircraft make, but wrong somehow, more mechanical. I looked up and there it was, maybe 300 feet above me. A black quadcopter with equipment packages that definitely weren't civilian gear. Thermal imaging, probably some kind of signals intelligence equipment, the works. It didn't approach me directly, just flew in a search pattern like it was mapping the area, looking for heat signatures or electronic emissions. I stood perfectly still under a tree until it moved on. Then I ran back here, grabbed my emergency bag, and seriously considered disappearing deeper into the wilderness. But here's the thing, I'm 42 years old, I'm tired of running, and winter's coming on fast. I've probably got 2, maybe 3 months before the real cold hits and this place becomes genuinely uninhabitable without serious supplies I don't have. So I made a decision. If they're going to find me anyway, if this is endgame, then I'm going to make sure someone knows the truth first. The truth is, I'm not a whistleblower or some hero trying to expose government secrets. I'm just a pilot who saw something he wasn't supposed to see, in a place he wasn't supposed to be, and made the mistake of thinking that meant something, that people had a right to know. The US government, along with about a dozen other nations, have been hiding something in Antarctica for at least 60 years, probably longer. And I'm not talking about some secret military base or climate research they don't want publicized. I'm talking about technology that isn't ours, structures that predate human civilization by thousands of years, and evidence that we've never been alone on this planet. I saw it with my own eyes. I walked inside it. I took photos that are hidden in a location I'll tell you about if this recording makes it out. And for the last 3 years, I've been paying the price for that knowledge. Look, I know how this sounds. I get it. Some guy hiding in the Canadian wilderness claiming he found alien technology in Antarctica? It sounds like every conspiracy theory documentary you've ever laughed at. But here's what I want you to understand. I didn't go looking for this. I wasn't some UFO enthusiast or ancient aliens believer. I was a cargo pilot doing a job, following orders, trying to make it through another Antarctic season so I could collect my paycheck and go home. What I found, it found me. Or maybe I was put in a position where I couldn't avoid finding it. I still don't know which. What I do know is that there are people, powerful people from multiple governments, who've made it their mission to keep this secret, and they don't care who they have to silence to do it. I've seen what happens to people who talk. I knew a pilot named Rodriguez who violated the flight restrictions before I did. His plane went down 6 months later in what they called mechanical failure. I knew a scientist at McMurdo Station who started asking too many questions about the restricted zones. She had a skiing accident that broke her neck. So yeah, I'm scared. I'm terrified, actually. But I'm also done hiding. If you're still listening, thank you. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I'm going to give you dates, coordinates, names, everything I can remember from my time in Antarctica. I'm going to tell you about the flight restrictions that don't make sense, the zones that don't appear on any public map, and the things I saw when an emergency forced me to land in a place that officially doesn't exist. I'm going to tell you about the installation buried in the ice, about technology that still works after thousands of years, and about the international conspiracy that's kept all of this hidden from the 7 billion people on this planet who deserve to know the truth. And if something happens to me before I finish, if this recording cuts off or if I just disappear, well, at least someone will know I tried. The drone's probably going to come back, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a few days. When it does, they'll triangulate my location and send people. Real people this time, not just surveillance equipment. So I need to talk fast, and I need you to listen carefully, because the story I'm about to tell you changes everything you think you know about Antarctica, about human history, and about our place in this universe. So let me take you back to where this all started. January 2020. I was stationed at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, flying routine cargo missions. Mostly domestic stuff. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. Just the kind of work you do when you're in your late 30s, and the military's decided you're more valuable as a delivery driver than a combat pilot. I'm not complaining, honestly. After 16 years of service, including 2 tours in the Middle East, I was okay with boring. Boring meant I got to sleep in my own bed, eat food that wasn't MREs, and have something resembling a normal life. Then one Tuesday afternoon, I got called into Colonel Marsh's office, and he introduced me to a guy who changed everything. His name was Dr. Richard Coleman, civilian contractor, and he had an offer that seemed too good to be true, which, looking back, should have been my first clue to walk away. Coleman wasn't military, but he had the kind of security clearance that made colonels straighten their postures when he walked into the room. He wore an expensive suit that looked out of place on a military base, spoke with a calm, measured tone that made everything sound reasonable, and had these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink quite enough. "Captain Foster," he said, not bothering with small talk, "your record shows extensive experience with long-distance cargo operations in extreme weather conditions. C-130 qualified, over 3,000 flight hours, excellent safety record, and, this is important, no immediate family that would miss you during extended deployments." That last part should have bothered me more than it did. He wasn't asking if I had family. He already knew I didn't. My parents had passed when I was in my 20s, no siblings, and my last relationship had ended 2 years earlier because, as she put it, I was married to the Air Force. Coleman had done his homework. "We're looking for pilots to support research operations in Antarctica," he continued. "Contract work, 6-month rotations, very good pay. Interested?" The money he was offering was absurd. 3 times my military salary for what he described as routine supply runs between research stations. I remember sitting in that office, doing the math in my head, and thinking that kind of money for cargo flights didn't make sense unless there was something they weren't telling me. "Why so much?" I asked. "Because I'm not stupid enough to think the government pays premium rates for simple work." Coleman smiled, but it didn't reach those gray eyes. Antarctica is the most hostile flying environment on Earth, Captain. Extreme cold, unpredictable weather, navigation challenges that most pilots can't handle. We pay well because we need the best, and because the work requires absolute discretion. Everything you'll be transporting, everywhere you'll be flying, all of it falls under international research protocols that are highly classified. You'll be working with scientists from multiple nations, accessing facilities that don't officially exist on any public record. If you can't handle that level of confidentiality, this isn't the job for you. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why civilian research needed that kind of secrecy. But I was thinking about that paycheck, about finally paying off debts and maybe having something in savings for once in my life. The training started 3 weeks later at a facility I'd never heard of in upstate New York. It wasn't a normal military training center, more like a corporate campus with serious security and no identifying markers anywhere. There were 12 of us in that initial group, all experienced cargo pilots from different branches of service, all with similar profiles to mine. Single, no close family, excellent records, and as I learned over the following weeks, all of us in need of money for various reasons. They spent the first week teaching us extreme weather flying procedures, which made sense for Antarctic operations. But then came the navigation training, and that's when things started feeling wrong. They gave us GPS systems that were completely locked down. You couldn't deviate from programmed flight paths even if you wanted to. The routes were preloaded, the waypoints were fixed, and attempting to override the system would trigger immediate alerts back to command. Antarctica is vast and dangerous, the instructor explained. A woman named Sarah Chen, who spoke like she was reading from a script. These routes are designed for maximum safety and efficiency. Deviation from approved flight paths puts you, your cargo, and the research operations at risk. But here's what bothered me. The routes had massive gaps in them. We'd fly from point A to point B, but the GPS would show these huge sections of territory marked as restricted airspace, no overflight authorized. And I'm not talking about small areas. Some of these restricted zones covered hundreds of square miles of interior Antarctica, regions that weren't near any known research stations or territorial claims. When I asked Chen about them, she got this tight look on her face and said, "Those are international exclusion zones established by the Antarctic Treaty. Environmental protection areas, wildlife preserves, that sort of thing. You don't need to worry about them because your routes don't go anywhere near them." But that was bullshit, and I knew it. I'd flown missions over actual environmental protection areas before, and they didn't come with this level of restriction or the kind of security warnings these zones had. These weren't marked as wildlife preserves. They were marked as unauthorized entry will result in immediate interception and possible use of force. What kind of penguin protection requires military interception? The final week of training was when they really hammered home the importance of following flight paths exactly. We had daily briefings where they showed us satellite footage of aircraft that had deviated from approved routes in Antarctic airspace over the past decade. They didn't tell us what happened to those aircraft, but the implication was clear. Some had crashed, some had been intercepted, and some had simply disappeared from radar and were never found. Antarctica is unforgiving, Coleman told us during the final briefing, and this time his expression was dead serious. The weather can turn in minutes, creating whiteout conditions that make navigation impossible. Magnetic anomalies can throw off your instruments, and there are regions of the continent where rescue operations are simply not feasible. If you deviate from your assigned route and get into trouble, there's a very real possibility that no one will be able to reach you in time. Then he paused, letting that sink in, before adding something that I'll never forget. And more importantly, there are restricted areas that are off limits for reasons that go beyond your security clearance. If you violate those restrictions, even by accident, the consequences will be severe. Not just for you, but for this entire program. Do you understand? We all nodded, signed more non-disclosure agreements than I could count, and by February 2020, I was on a military transport heading to Christchurch, New Zealand, the jumping-off point for Antarctic operations. I remember sitting in that cargo hold, surrounded by other pilots who all looked as uncertain as I felt, wondering what the hell we'd just signed up for. The money was great, sure, but something about Coleman's warnings, about those restricted zones that covered huge sections of the continent, about the emphasis on absolute obedience to flight paths. It felt wrong. One of the other pilots, a guy named Mike Rodriguez, who I'd later become friends with, leaned over during the flight and said something that stuck with me. "You know what I think?" he said quietly. "I think we're not there to support research. I think we're there to avoid seeing something. All this training, all these restrictions, they're not protecting us. They're protecting whatever's in those zones from being seen." I laughed it off at the time, told him he was being paranoid. But Mike was right. God, he was so right. And 3 years later, I'd be hiding in the Canadian wilderness because I'd seen exactly what those zones were hiding, and it was so much worse and so much more incredible than any of us could have imagined. My first month in Antarctica was, look, I'm not gonna lie, it was beautiful in a terrifying kind of way. Flying over that continent, seeing ice formations that stretch for hundreds of miles, mountains that have never been climbed, landscapes so alien they could be on another planet. It's humbling, makes you feel incredibly small, but it's also when I started noticing just how weird the operational protocols were. Every flight, and I mean every single one, had a route that was programmed into the GPS before I even got into the cockpit. I couldn't access the programming interface, couldn't modify waypoints, couldn't even see alternative routes if I'd wanted to. The system would guide me from McMurdo Station, that's the main US research base, to wherever I was delivering supplies, and then straight back. No deviation, no flexibility, no pilot discretion. And for a guy who'd been flying for 16 years, who'd navigated combat zones where you had to make split-second routing decisions to avoid surface-to-air missiles, being treated like a glorified autopilot passenger it felt wrong. The restricted zones were everywhere, and they made no goddamn sense. I'm talking about massive sections of the continent, hundreds of square miles, marked on our navigation systems as absolute no-fly zones. Not avoid if possible or restricted without authorization, but hard boundaries that would trigger immediate alerts if you got within 10 kilometers of them. Some of these zones were in the middle of nowhere, places where there were no research stations, no territorial claims, no obvious reason for restriction. I asked my commanding officer, a Navy guy named Commander Phillips, about them during my second week. "Sir, some of these exclusion zones are blocking what would be much more efficient routes between stations. Is there any flexibility on the boundaries?" He looked at me like I'd just asked if I could fly the plane upside down for fun. "Foster, those zones exist for reasons above both our pay grades. International treaty obligations, environmental protection, scientific research that requires isolation from air traffic. Your job is to fly the routes you're given, not to question why they exist." But the way he said it, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, he didn't believe his own explanation any more than I did. What really got my attention was the altitude restrictions. On certain routes, we weren't just restricted laterally. We had to maintain specific altitudes, usually pretty low, around 5,000 feet. Now in Antarctica, weather can change in minutes, and having altitude to work with is often the difference between riding out a storm and getting smashed into a mountain. Any experienced pilot will tell you that altitude is safety, it's options, it's your buffer against the 1,000 things that can go wrong. But on these particular routes, especially the ones that skirted the edges of the major exclusion zones, we were required to stay low. When I asked the flight operations officer why, she gave me this rehearsed answer about minimizing atmospheric disturbance to sensitive research equipment. I've flown near plenty of sensitive research equipment in my career. Radio telescopes, atmospheric monitoring stations, all kinds of scientific gear, and none of them ever required aircraft to stay at specific altitudes miles away. This was something else. They didn't want us seeing something from higher altitude. That was the only explanation that made sense. The other pilots felt it too. We'd talk about it sometimes, carefully in the rec room at McMurdo after our shifts, always aware that conversations were probably monitored even in our downtime. Most of the guys just accepted it. Weird rules were part of working in Antarctica, and the paycheck was too good to risk asking uncomfortable questions. But there were a few, like Mike Rodriguez, who couldn't let it go. Mike was always pulling up satellite imagery on his personal laptop, trying to figure out what was in those restricted zones, cross-referencing the coordinates with public databases of Antarctic research stations. "Look at this," he showed me one night, about 6 weeks into our rotation. This exclusion zone here, Zone Delta 7, it's 300 square miles of interior ice sheet. No research stations within 100 miles, no territorial claims, no geological features of interest according to any public scientific literature. So what the hell are we not supposed to fly over? I told him to drop it, that it wasn't worth jeopardizing the job. But Mike had this look in his eyes, this determination that I recognized from my own mirror. He wasn't going to let it go. Then people started leaving, not retiring or finishing their contracts, just suddenly not being there anymore. First was a pilot named Sandra Chen, not related to our instructor from training. She'd been asking questions about the electromagnetic interference that some of us were experiencing near certain exclusion zones. Compass anomalies, radio static, GPS fluctuations that didn't match any known Antarctic magnetic phenomena. One day she was at breakfast talking about filing a formal report with the National Science Foundation, and the next day her quarters were empty and we were told she'd requested immediate reassignment for family reasons. No goodbye, no forwarding contact, just gone. Then it was James Mitchell, a C-17 pilot who'd been documenting discrepancies between our restricted flight zones and the official Antarctic treaty maps available to the public. He decided to pursue opportunities in the private sector, according to the announcement. Within 48 hours of making that decision, apparently. When Mike tried to contact him through his old Air Force email, the address bounced back as non-existent. Mike Rodriguez was the third one to disappear, and that's when I started to get genuinely scared. He'd been more vocal than the rest of us, asking questions during briefings, requesting access to scientific rationale for the flight restrictions, pushing back when the answers didn't make sense. I remember our last conversation, sitting outside the operations building under that weird Antarctic twilight, where the sun never really sets during summer. "Dan," he said, and he looked tired, older than his 41 years. I put in a request to access the historical flight data from the 70s and 80s. Wanted to see if these exclusion zones have always existed or if they're new. My request got denied within an hour, and then Coleman himself called me into his office. He didn't threaten me, not explicitly, but he made it very clear that curiosity about operational protocols was incompatible with continued employment in this program. Mike paused, staring out at the ice. "I'm gonna finish this rotation and get out. This place, there's something wrong here, man. Something they're hiding that's big enough to make people disappear." 2 weeks later, Mike was gone. Equipment failure during a routine flight, they said. Crashed into the Ross ice shelf. No survivors. Body never recovered. But here's the thing. I'd flown with Mike dozens of times. He was meticulous about pre-flight checks. One of the best pilots I'd ever worked with, and the aircraft he was flying had been serviced just 3 days before. Equipment failure. Sure. After Mike's death, and I'm calling it death because I don't believe it was an accident, I made a decision. I was going to keep my head down, fly my routes exactly as programmed, ask 0 questions, and count the days until my contract was up. I had 4 months left on my rotation, and then I was done with Antarctica forever. The money wasn't worth it. Not if it meant ending up like Mike or disappearing like Sandra and James. But the universe has a funny way of making plans for you when you're trying to avoid trouble. Because 3 months later, in December 2021, I'd be forced into one of those restricted zones by a storm that came out of nowhere, and I'd discover exactly what they'd been hiding all along. And once I saw it, once I understood what was buried in that ice and why they'd been keeping it secret for decades, well, there was no going back to a normal life after that. Some knowledge you can't unknow, some truths you can't pretend you never learned, and some secrets are dangerous enough that people will kill to protect them, which is exactly why I've been hiding in this Canadian wilderness for 3 years, and why that drone circling overhead means my time is probably running out. McMurdo Station is the largest research base in Antarctica, home to over 1,000 people during summer operations, and honestly, it's weirdly normal in a lot of ways. There's a cafeteria that serves surprisingly decent food, a gym, a store where you can buy basic supplies and souvenirs, even a coffee shop that would fit in at any American suburb. For the first few weeks, that normalcy was comforting. After the intense training and all the ominous warnings about restricted zones, being somewhere that felt almost like a small town was reassuring. But the longer I stayed there, the more I noticed the cracks in that normalcy. The way certain buildings had security that seemed excessive for scientific research. The way some personnel wore badges with color codes I'd never seen before. The way conversations would stop abruptly when certain people walked into a room. McMurdo had two faces. The public face that matched what you'd expect from an international research station, and something else underneath. Something that operated by completely different rules. The scientists were the first obvious sign that things weren't what they seemed. Most of them were friendly enough, the kind of passionate researchers you'd expect at the bottom of the world. Geologists studying ice core samples, biologists researching extremophile organisms, climatologists monitoring weather patterns. They'd talk your ear off about their work if you showed even mild interest. But then there were the others. You could spot them because they didn't socialize much, ate at different times than the main research staff, and when you asked them what they were working on, they'd give these vague, rehearsed answers that said absolutely nothing. Climate data analysis, one woman told me when I asked at the coffee shop. Long-term atmospheric monitoring, said another guy I met in the gym. But here's the thing. I'd transported equipment for some of these people, and the cargo didn't match their cover stories. Climate monitoring doesn't require electromagnetic shielding containers. Atmospheric research doesn't need equipment that's kept at specific temperatures usually reserved for biological samples. And those bland, forgettable answers, they were too perfect, too practiced, like everyone had been given the same script. About 3 weeks into my rotation, I was making a supply run to a small research station called Lake Hoare Camp, and I got weathered in for the night. Nothing dangerous, just conditions too poor to fly back safely. The two scientists stationed there, Dr. Lisa Warren and Dr. James Kim, were friendly enough, made dinner, set me up in a spare bunk. After dinner, over drinks, yes, even in Antarctica scientists find ways to have alcohol. Dr. Warren got a little loose-lipped. "You know what I miss most about civilization?" she said, words slightly slurred. "Being able to talk about my actual work. Do you know how exhausting it is to pretend you're studying something completely different than what you're actually doing, for months at a time?" Dr. Kim shot her a warning look, but she waved him off. "Oh, come on, James. He's got level 3 clearance just by being here. He knows things aren't what they seem." Then she looked at me, eyes suddenly more sober than her voice. "You ever wonder why they need cargo pilots on such rigid routes, Captain Foster? It's not about safety. It's about making sure you only see what they want you to see." The restricted areas within McMurdo itself were another weird thing that I didn't fully appreciate until I'd been there a while. The base is big, sprawling, with dozens of buildings connected by roads and walkways, and most of it you could access freely as long as you had basic base credentials. But scattered throughout were buildings marked Level 5 Access Only, or Authorized Personnel, Biometric Verification Required. These weren't in some separate secured compound. They were mixed right in with the regular facilities. Building 239 was right next to the equipment warehouse where I'd pick up cargo manifests. Building 157 shared a wall with the main power plant, and the people who went in and out of these buildings, they were a different breed. They moved with purpose, didn't make small talk, and had this intensity that reminded me of special operations personnel I'd worked with in combat zones. People on a mission who didn't have time for anything that didn't directly serve their objectives. I tried to get into one of those buildings once, purely by accident. I was looking for the weather briefing office, got turned around in the maze of corridors that all look identical when you're new, and ended up in front of a door marked Building 157B Level 5 Clearance Required. The door looked the same as every other door. Standard industrial, painted the same institutional beige. But when I tried the handle out of habit, before I even processed the sign, alarms went off. Not loud sirens, but a localized alert sound and flashing lights above the door. Within 30 seconds, 2 security personnel appeared from somewhere, and I mean appeared, they moved that fast, and very politely but very firmly asked to see my credentials. "Wrong building, Captain Foster," one of them said, checking my badge against a tablet. "Weather office is building 141, next corridor over. This is a restricted research facility." The other guard was studying me with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't just routine. "First time you've tried to access a restricted building?" he asked. I explained about being lost, and after what felt like a very long minute, they accepted that explanation and escorted me, not directed, escorted, to the actual weather office. But I'd seen something in that brief moment before they arrived. Through a window in the door, I'd glimpsed a corridor that looked nothing like the rest of McMurdo. The walls were white, almost clinically sterile, and the lighting was different. Not the fluorescent institutional fixtures that were everywhere else, but something closer to natural daylight. And I'd seen people in environmental suits, the kind you wear when working with hazardous materials or, I don't know, maybe things that aren't from this planet. It was around my second month that I started to understand there were essentially two operations running in Antarctica. The official scientific mission that was documented, publicized, and followed the Antarctic Treaty Protocols, and the real operation that existed in those restricted zones, both on the ground and in the air. The official operation was what tourists could read about, what congressional oversight committees were briefed on, what international observers monitored to ensure treaty compliance. Research stations studying climate change, marine biology, glaciology, astronomy. All legitimate, all real, all exactly what they appeared to be. But underneath and around that legitimate research was something else entirely. Something that used the official operation as cover and camouflage. The restricted flight zones corresponded with restricted ground areas. The scientists with vague job descriptions worked in buildings that required level 5 access. The cargo I transported in sealed containers that I wasn't allowed to inspect connected the dots between facilities that officially didn't communicate with each other. It was a parallel infrastructure using the same resources, the same bases, the same logistics network, but serving a completely different purpose. The moment I really understood this dual structure was during a routine briefing about increased scientific activity in the upcoming weeks. Commander Phillips was explaining that we'd have more flights to remote stations, some night operations, the usual logistical information. Then Dr. Coleman, the same guy who'd recruited us, appeared via video link and added what he called a supplemental operational note. Some of your routes will be adjusted temporarily to accommodate sensitive time-critical research, he said, and his pale gray eyes seemed to look directly at each of us through the screen. You may notice increased security presence at certain facilities, equipment that doesn't match your understanding of typical research activities, and personnel who don't engage in normal social interaction. This is all standard for specialized projects operating under international protocols that require additional security measures. Your job remains the same. Fly the routes you're given, transport the cargo you're assigned, and maintain absolute discretion about anything you observe that seems outside normal research parameters. After the briefing, I walked back to my quarters thinking about that phrase. Anything you observe that seems outside normal research parameters. That wasn't instructions for handling scientific secrecy. That was a warning not to ask questions about the things that didn't make sense, the things that suggested something far stranger than climate research was happening on this frozen continent. And I realized that everyone stationed there, the pilots, the support staff, even most of the scientists, we were all part of the cover story, the public face that gave legitimacy to whatever was really going on in those restricted buildings and forbidden zones. We were the normal that made the abnormal invisible. There was one pilot at McMurdo who'd been doing Antarctic runs longer than anyone else in the program. A guy named Thomas Brennan, call sign ICE, 53 years old, been flying cargo to the continent for almost 12 years. Most contract pilots did 1, maybe 2 rotations, before moving on to easier jobs that didn't involve 6 months of darkness and temperatures that could kill you in minutes. But ICE kept coming back, season after season, and people said it was because he'd gone through a nasty divorce, and Antarctica was the one place his ex-wife couldn't reach him. Looking back now, I think it was something else. I think he stayed because he knew things, had seen things, and he was trying to figure out what the hell was really going on down here. We didn't talk much during my first 2 months. ICE kept to himself mostly, ate alone, spent his off hours in his quarters instead of socializing in the rec room. But in early May, about 3 months into my rotation, he approached me after a flight briefing and said something that would change everything. "Foster, you got a minute? There's something you should know before you've been here long enough for it to matter." We walked to the edge of the base, out past the last building where the ice sheet stretched away into nothing, and ICE lit a cigarette with hands that shook slightly in the cold. "How many pilots you noticed leaving suddenly?" he asked, not looking at me. "Chen, Mitchell, Rodriguez," I said, and ICE nodded slowly. "Rodriguez didn't leave, kid. Rodriguez is dead. no matter what they told you about equipment failure. I've seen it happen before. I've been watching it happen for 12 years. He took a long drag on his cigarette. There are rules here that go beyond what they tell you in briefings. And the most important rule, the one that matters more than anything else, is this: never, ever deviate from your assigned flight path. Not for weather, not for emergency, not for any reason. Because if you see what's in those restricted zones, you don't get to leave Antarctica alive. The way he said it, flat and matter of fact, like he was explaining weather patterns instead of murder. It made my blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" I asked, and Ice turned to look at me finally. And his eyes had this haunted quality that I recognized from combat veterans who'd seen too much. "In the 12 years I've been flying down here," Ice said, "I've personally known 6 pilots who died in accidents. See, all of them were experienced. All of them were flying aircraft that had been recently serviced and maintained. And all of them had one thing in common. They'd violated restricted airspace within a week of their deaths." He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket, worn and dog-eared, filled with handwriting. David Martinez, 2011, flew into Zone Delta 7 during a medical emergency evacuation. His plane went down 3 days later in what they called a navigation system failure. Sarah Thompson, 2013, got blown off course during a storm and briefly entered Zone Echo 3. Crashed on her next routine flight, fuel system malfunction. Kevin Park, 2015, actually landed in a restricted area after an engine fire forced him down. They recovered him, brought him back to McMurdo, and 2 weeks later he fell off an ice cliff during a routine walk. Accidental death. Ice flipped through more pages, and I could see dates, names, circumstances. Peter Novak, 2017. Lisa Chen, 2019. And your friend Mike Rodriguez, just 2 months ago. All dead. All within days or weeks of seeing something they weren't supposed to see. I wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, reading patterns into coincidence, but the notebook in his hands had too many details, too many documented cases for it to be imagination. "Why are you still alive then?" I asked. "You've been here 12 years. You must know something." Ice smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because I'm careful, Foster. Because I follow every single flight restriction to the letter. I don't ask questions. I don't deviate from routes, even when it would make more sense to do so. And I've made it very clear through my actions that I'm not a threat to whatever operation they're running here. And because..." He paused, seemed to struggle with something. "Because I did violate a restricted zone once, 7 years ago. And what I saw scared me so badly that they knew I'd never tell anyone. They let me live because I became the perfect example of successful intimidation." He took a final drag on his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "But you, Foster, you're new, you're curious, you're friends with people who ask too many questions. So I'm giving you the same advice I wish someone had given me. Fly your routes. Don't look too closely at what you're carrying, and never ever fly beyond Point Nemo." Point Nemo. I'd heard the term before in navigation training. It's the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, the point in the South Pacific that's furthest from any landmass, but also sometimes used to refer to the most remote regions of Antarctica itself. "What's at Point Nemo?" I asked, knowing Ice probably wouldn't answer, but needing to ask anyway. He looked out at the ice for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not the question you should be asking, kid. The question is what's beyond Point Nemo, in those regions that don't appear on any public map, in zones that are restricted not by treaty but by international agreement between governments that usually can't agree on anything." He turned to me, and I could see genuine fear in his face. "Whatever it is, it's important enough that they'll kill to protect it. Important enough that they've been covering it up for decades, maybe longer. Important enough that they maintain an entire infrastructure of legitimate research as camouflage for the real operation." Ice told me other things during that conversation, pieces of a puzzle that I was only beginning to understand. About cargo manifests that didn't match the actual equipment he'd transported, sealed containers that were heavier or lighter than their listed contents, flight routes that made no logistical sense unless the real destination was somewhere other than the stated research station. About personnel who'd arrive at McMurdo with one set of credentials and leave with another, as if they'd become different people during their rotation. about communication blackouts that occurred during specific times, when certain coordinates in the restricted zones showed increased activity on thermal imaging satellites. Not that we were supposed to have access to that imagery, but ICE had sources, connections from his years in the Air Force that still provided him with information they probably shouldn't have. "The thing you need to understand," he said as we walked back toward the base, "is that Antarctica isn't what they tell the public it is. The Antarctic Treaty, all that talk about peaceful scientific cooperation and environmental protection, that's real, but it's also cover for something else. Something that all those governments discovered decades ago and decided was too dangerous, too paradigm-shifting, to ever let the public know about." The last thing I said to me before we parted ways haunts me to this day, especially now that I'm sitting in this cabin waiting for them to find me. "You seem like a good guy, Foster. Competent pilot, asking the right questions but not pushing too hard yet. So I'm telling you this because I wish someone had told me. You've still got time to finish your contract and walk away. Keep your head down for 3 more months, take your money, and never come back to Antarctica. Don't be like Rodriguez. Don't be like the others who thought they could expose the truth and survive. This isn't a conspiracy you can blow the whistle on. This is something that involves every major government on Earth, resources that dwarf most national budgets, and people who've invested decades in maintaining the secret. You can't fight that. You can only survive it by pretending you never saw it. And you know what? I wish I'd listened to him. I wish I'd kept my head down, finished my rotation, and gone back to flying cargo in Colorado. But 7 months later, a storm would force me into one of those restricted zones, and I'd see what ICE had seen, what Rodriguez had died for seeing, what has kept me hiding in the Canadian wilderness for 3 years. And once you see it, once you understand what's really out there buried in the ice, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. You can't go back to normal life knowing that everything you were taught about human history, about our place in the universe, about the timeline of civilization itself, it's all wrong. And that knowledge, that burden of truth, it's heavier than any cargo I ever flew. December 14th, 2021. That's the date everything changed for me. I remember it being a perfect Antarctic summer day when I took off from McMurdo. Temperatures around 0 Celsius, which is practically tropical down there. Clear skies, visibility unlimited. I was flying a routine supply run to a research station called Dome Charlie, about 400 miles into the interior. Standard flight, nothing unusual about it. Cargo was sealed containers marked as scientific equipment. Route was pre-programmed into the GPS as always. I'd done this exact run probably 20 times over the previous 5 months. Expected flight time was 3 hours each way. Land, offload cargo, grab a meal with the scientists stationed there. Fly back to McMurdo before the evening weather briefing. Easy day. I was actually looking forward to it because it meant time alone in the cockpit, away from the weird tension that had been building at McMurdo ever since Mike Rodriguez's death. But about 90 minutes into the flight, something happened that shouldn't have been possible. The weather, which had been absolutely pristine, just changed. And I don't mean it changed gradually like normal weather systems. I mean it went from clear skies to complete whiteout conditions in less than 5 minutes. The first indication something was wrong came from the radio. I was maintaining routine check-in protocols with McMurdo Flight Ops when the transmission started breaking up with interference I'd never heard before. Not the normal static you get from atmospheric conditions, but this weird pulsing sound that almost seemed rhythmic, artificial. McMurdo Ops, this is Cargo 7. I'm experiencing communication interference. Please repeat last transmission. Nothing but that pulsing static. I switched frequencies, tried the emergency channel, even attempted to raise Dome Charlie directly, but every channel had the same interference pattern. Okay, not great, but not catastrophic either. I had my navigation systems, my instruments, and the GPS route would get me to Dome Charlie even without radio contact. Then the GPS started glitching. Not failing completely, but showing my position jumping around by several miles every few seconds, like the satellite signal was being jammed or disrupted. I'd flown through magnetic anomalies before in Antarctica. There are regions where the Earth's magnetic field gets weird and compasses go haywire. But this was different. This was my GPS, which uses satellites and has nothing to do with magnetic fields, telling me I was in 3 different locations simultaneously. That's when I looked out the cockpit window and saw the weather building. I've flown in bad weather before. Thunderstorms over the Midwest, sandstorms in Iraq, typhoons in the Pacific, but I'd never seen anything develop this fast. On the horizon, about 20 miles ahead, was a wall of white that reached from the surface up to what looked like 40,000 feet. Just this massive curtain of snow and wind that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago wasn't on any of the weather forecasts I'd reviewed that morning and was directly in my flight path. Antarctic storms are dangerous as hell, but they don't just materialize out of nowhere. They show up on weather radar, on satellite imagery. You get warnings, you get time to divert or turn back. This thing, it was like someone had flipped a switch and decided to drop a mountain of snow directly in front of me. I immediately tried to radio McMurdo, get permission to divert around it, but all I got was that pulsing interference. My aircraft's weather radar was going crazy, showing return signals that suggested the storm was everywhere, all around me, which made no sense because behind me was still clear sky. I had maybe 3 minutes to make a decision before I hit that wall of white, and none of my options were good. I could try to fly through it, but without functioning GPS or radio communication, I'd be flying blind in zero visibility with no way to maintain orientation or avoid terrain. Antarctica is all mountains and ice sheets, and slamming into either at 300 knots means you don't walk away. I could try to turn back toward McMurdo, but my fuel calculations were based on a direct route to Dome Charlie. Turning back meant I might not make it before running dry, and landing on the ice sheet without navigation would be suicide. Or I could divert around the storm, which meant leaving my pre-programmed route and potentially entering one of those restricted zones that ice had warned me about. I looked at my navigation display, saw that the storm was forcing me toward Zone Delta 7, one of the big ones, 300 square miles of nothing according to official records, and the same zone that David Martinez had entered back in 2011 before his fatal accident. Ice's words echoed in my head. Never deviate from your assigned flight path, not for any reason. But the alternative was flying into a storm that would kill me for certain. I banked hard to the south, away from the storm and off my programmed route. The moment I crossed out of the approved flight corridor, alarms started going off in my cockpit. Not mechanical alarms, but alerts from the GPS system warning me that I was entering restricted airspace without authorization. A computerized voice kept repeating, "Return to approved flight path immediately," while the navigation display showed my aircraft icon with a flashing red border. I ignored it, focused on flying, on getting around this impossible storm. But here's the thing that made it impossible. The storm moved with me. I'd bank south to avoid it, and it would shift south. I'd try to go north, and the wall of white would be there too, like it was hurting me, forcing me deeper into the restricted zone. After 20 minutes of this, burning fuel I didn't have to spare, I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. This was deliberate. Something or someone was using weather manipulation to force me exactly where I was going, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My instruments started failing about 40 minutes after the GPS glitches began. First, the altimeter went haywire, showing me at sea level 1 second and 30,000 feet the next. Then the artificial horizon tumbled, making it impossible to tell if I was flying level or in a bank. My magnetic compass was spinning like a top. The only instruments that still worked were the most basic ones: airspeed, engine temperature, fuel gauge. I was essentially flying by feel and visual reference in an environment that was rapidly losing all visual reference as the storm closed in around me. The smart thing to do would have been to land immediately, anywhere, before I completely lost the ability to control the aircraft. But I was in Zone Delta 7 now, well beyond any authorized landing areas, and my fuel situation meant I couldn't make it back to McMurdo, even if the storm suddenly cleared. I was committed. I was going to have to land somewhere in this restricted zone, and whatever happened after that was out of my hands. The wind was getting worse, buffeting the aircraft, and the visibility was dropping to near zero. I dropped my altitude, trying to stay below the worst of the weather, flying at maybe 1,000 feet above the surface, dangerously low in mountainous terrain. But I needed to be able to see the ground when the time came to put this thing down. That's when I saw it through a brief break in the clouds. An ice plane that looked smooth enough for an emergency landing, and beyond it, structures that definitely weren't natural formations. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing, didn't have time to think about the implications. My fuel warning light was on, I was running on fumes, and that ice plane was my only option for survival. I lined up for approach, no flaps because I didn't trust any of my hydraulic systems at that point, came in hot and fast, touched down harder than any landing I'd made in 16 years of flying. The aircraft bounced, skidded, and I fought to keep it straight as we slid across the ice, finally coming to rest about 300 yards from where I'd first touched down. I sat there in the sudden silence, engines spooling down, hands shaking on the controls, and realized I'd just done exactly what ice had warned me never to do. I'd entered a restricted zone. I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. And based on the pattern he documented in that notebook, I probably had days or weeks before an accident ended my life. But I didn't know yet, couldn't have known, that the structures I'd glimpsed through the storm were just the beginning. I didn't know that within the next few hours, I'd discover something that would make me understand why they were willing to kill to keep this place secret. And I didn't know that my life as I knew it was effectively over the moment those wheels touched down on the ice. I need to back up a bit and tell you about what happened during those 40 minutes before I landed, because it's important to understand. This wasn't equipment failure. I've been a pilot for 20 years. I know what mechanical problems look like, sound like, feel like, through the controls. Hydraulic failures have a specific pressure drop pattern. Electrical shorts create smoke and burning smells. Engine problems change the vibration and sound of the aircraft. What was happening to my instruments wasn't any of those things. It was interference, systematic and progressive, like something was actively disrupting every electronic system in the aircraft, the closer I got to the center of Zone Delta 7. And the weird part, the part that still gives me nightmares, is that it felt targeted, intelligent, like whatever was causing the interference knew exactly which systems to disrupt, in which order to force me down without killing me. If they'd wanted me dead, they could have knocked out my engines. Instead, they took away my ability to navigate, to communicate, to do anything except land exactly where they wanted me to land. The electromagnetic interference started subtle. About 10 minutes after I first noticed the GPS glitching, my digital displays began showing artifacts, pixels flickering, numbers that would briefly change to symbols I didn't recognize before reverting back to normal readouts. I thought maybe it was just a loose connection or power fluctuation, but then my backup instruments started doing the same thing. In aviation, you have redundant systems specifically because primary instruments fail. You've got a main GPS and a backup GPS, primary radio and emergency radio, multiple battery systems, multiple ways to control the aircraft. But all of them were being affected simultaneously, which doesn't happen with mechanical failure. That requires something external, something that's generating a field powerful enough to affect shielded electronics through the aircraft's fuselage. I've flown near powerful radar installations before, been close to military electronic warfare systems during training, and this felt similar, but orders of magnitude stronger. Whatever was generating this field wasn't just powerful, it was massive, probably covering the entire restricted zone. The compass was the most disturbing part. I've mentioned it was spinning, but that doesn't really capture how wrong it looked. The needle was rotating clockwise, steadily, like it was being pulled by something with enormous magnetic force. But here's the thing. It wasn't fluctuating or jerking like you'd see near a magnetic anomaly. It was smooth, constant, completing one full rotation about every 4 seconds. I timed it out of habit, pilot training kicking in even though I was way past the point where that information was useful. But I timed it because my brain was trying to find patterns, trying to understand what kind of magnetic field could do that. Natural magnetic anomalies don't create steady rotational forces. They distort, they push and pull, but they don't spin compass needles like clock hands. This was artificial. This was technology. And the strength required to affect a compass through the aircraft's shielding meant whatever was generating the field was either incredibly powerful or incredibly close, or both. I kept my eyes on that spinning needle, almost hypnotized by it, until I realized I was wasting mental bandwidth on something I couldn't control when I should have been focused on staying airborne. The radio sounds were worse than the instrument failures because they suggested something I wasn't ready to accept. About 20 minutes into the interference, after I'd lost all conventional communications, I was cycling through frequencies out of desperation, hoping to find any channel that wasn't filled with that pulsing static. And on one frequency, I don't remember which one, everything was chaos by that point, I picked up something that definitely wasn't McMurdo ops, wasn't any human voice or normal radio transmission. It was, Christ, I don't even know how to describe it. Rhythmic pulses that had structure to them, like language, but not any language built for human vocal cords or human hearing. The frequencies were wrong. Some parts too low to really hear clearly. Some parts high enough that I felt them more than heard them, like pressure in my teeth and behind my eyes. And underneath that, there were harmonic patterns that kept shifting in ways that made my brain hurt, trying to follow them. I'm not a scientist. I can't explain it technically, but I know what human communication sounds like. And this wasn't it. This was something else trying to communicate, or maybe just leaking into frequencies we use. Or maybe, and this is the thought that terrified me, actively reaching out to my aircraft. I turned the radio off, just shut it down completely, because listening to those sounds was affecting me in ways I didn't understand. My heart rate was elevated, my hands were shaking worse than they should have been, even accounting for the stress of the situation. And I was getting this pressure headache that felt like someone was pushing on my skull from the inside. Later, after I'd landed and had time to think, I realized those weren't just sounds. They were having physiological effects, interacting with my nervous system in ways that human-generated radio signals don't. Which means whoever or whatever was broadcasting wasn't just using our communication protocols. They were using frequencies and modulation patterns that affected human biology. Whether that was intentional or just a side effect of non-human communication technology, I don't know. But I do know that in the 30 seconds I listened to those transmissions, I felt more alien, more exposed to something fundamentally other than human than at any point in my 16 years of military service, including 2 combat tours. The interference pattern had a geometry to it that I only noticed later when I was reviewing everything in my head. As I got closer to what I eventually realized was the center of Zone Delta 7, systems would fail in a specific sequence. First navigation, then communication, then flight instruments, moving from the more complex digital systems down to the simpler mechanical ones. It was like descending through layers of electromagnetic disruption, each layer stronger and affecting more primitive technology. By the time I was setting up for my emergency landing, the only instruments still working properly were the ones that didn't rely on electronics at all. My airspeed indicator, which is just a pressure sensor, and my eyes. Everything else was either dead or giving me readings that contradicted reality. I was flying by stick and rudder, using techniques that pilots haven't needed to rely on since the 1940s, before we had all these electronic aids. And you want to know what's really fucked up? The interference stopped the moment I landed. Like, literally the second my wheels touched ice, every system came back online. GPS locked on, radio cleared up, all my instruments snapped back to normal readings. Like something had been actively suppressing my systems to force me down. And once I was down, the interference was no longer necessary. That's when I understood this wasn't an accident, wasn't weather, wasn't mechanical failure or bad luck, or any of the explanations I'd been trying to convince myself of. This was controlled, deliberate. Something or someone in Zone Delta 7 had detected my approach, had used technology I couldn't understand to force me off course and guide me to a specific landing location, and had timed the interference so precisely that I could land safely, but couldn't do anything except land where they wanted me. Sitting there in the cockpit, engines off, sudden silence except for the wind outside, systems all working perfectly now that I was on the ground. I had this moment of absolute clarity and absolute terror. Whatever was out there in the structures I'd glimpsed through the storm, they knew I was here. They'd brought me here intentionally. And now that I was on the ground in the middle of a restricted zone 300 miles from McMurdo, with no way to call for help, and not enough fuel to take off again, I was completely at their mercy. ICE had warned me that pilots who entered these zones died in accidents. But sitting there in that cockpit, I realized that maybe some of them didn't die in accidents. Maybe some of them landed successfully, just like I had, and then discovered something in these zones that made death look like the better option. I sat in that cockpit for maybe 10 minutes after landing, just breathing, trying to get my heart rate down, checking systems that were suddenly working perfectly to confirm I wasn't hallucinating the whole thing. The GPS was showing my position as 82.4 degrees south, 157, 3 degrees east, which put me about 150 kilometers beyond the furthest authorized point of Zone Delta 7. For reference, that's deeper into Antarctica than most research stations, deeper than most satellite mapping, in a region that officially doesn't have anything worth studying according to every public database I'd ever seen. The fuel gauge showed I had maybe 20 minutes of flight time left, not enough to reach any authorized landing site, barely enough to get airborne and crash somewhere else. So even if I wanted to pretend this hadn't happened, fly away and report a navigation malfunction, I was stuck here. I was going to have to either wait for rescue, which meant explaining why I'd violated restricted airspace, or figure out survival on my own in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Neither option was good, but sitting in the aircraft wasn't going to change my situation. I needed to assess my surroundings, check the aircraft for damage, and figure out what the hell I was going to do next. The cold hit me like a physical force when I opened the cockpit door. I'd been flying with cabin heat on, insulated from the exterior temperature, and stepping out into Antarctic summer at 82 degrees south was like walking into a freezer, maybe negative 20 Celsius, with wind that cut through my flight suit despite the thermal layers underneath. I climbed down from the cockpit, boots crunching on ice that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in millennia, and did a walk-around inspection of the aircraft. Landing gear looked okay, no obvious structural damage, but one of the skis, we used ski-equipped aircraft for ice landings, had a crack that meant taking off again would be risky even if I had the fuel. The fuselage was covered in frost that had formed during the flight, and when I brushed it off the wing, my hand came away tingling from cold and from something else, a kind of static electricity that made my hair stand up under my flight cap. The aircraft was fine, or as fine as it could be after an emergency landing, but standing there next to it, looking around at the absolute emptiness of the Antarctic ice sheet, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The storm had cleared. Of course it had. It had served its purpose, and the sky was that deep, crystalline blue you only see in the polar regions. Visibility was unlimited, which is why I could see them. On the horizon, maybe 5 or 6 kilometers away, there were structures. Not rock formations, not ice ridges, not any kind of natural feature. Structures. Geometric, angular, clearly artificial, rising up from the ice like they'd been there forever, or had just emerged yesterday. I couldn't tell from that distance. Even through the cold and the wind and the residual adrenaline from the landing, my brain was trying to process what I was seeing and failing. There shouldn't be anything out here. No research stations, no historical expedition sites, no weather monitoring equipment. Zone Delta 7 was restricted precisely because it was supposed to be empty, pristine, untouched. But those structures on the horizon were not small. They had to be massive to be visible from 6 kilometers away, probably at least several stories tall. And the way they reflected light was wrong. Not like metal or concrete or any building material I recognized. The surfaces seemed to absorb and reflect light in patterns that shifted as clouds moved across the sun, creating an almost liquid shimmer that hurt my eyes when I tried to focus on details. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, just staring, my brain cycling through explanations and rejecting all of them. Secret military base? Wouldn't be built this deep in the restricted zone. And besides, the architecture was wrong. No antennas, no obvious power generation, no features that matched any military installation I'd ever seen. Research station? Even more unlikely. Scientists don't build structures that look like abstract sculptures in the most remote part of Antarctica. Historical site from some early expedition? The scale was wrong, and no explorer had ever penetrated this deep into the interior with enough resources to build something that large. With each rejected explanation, I was left with increasingly uncomfortable possibilities that my rational, military-trained mind didn't want to accept. Those structures weren't human. They couldn't be human. The technology required to build something that massive in this environment, the purpose for placing it in the most restricted zone on the continent, the fact that it had been kept secret from public knowledge, none of it made sense unless you accepted that human beings weren't the only intelligent species that had been to Antarctica. My hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. I was looking at something that fundamentally challenged everything I thought I knew about human history, about our place in the universe, about the timeline of technological development on Earth. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach drop, was the realization that this was what ice had warned me about. This was what Rodriguez had seen before his fatal accident. This was why 6 pilots over 12 years had died in accidents after violating restricted zones. Because seeing this, knowing this existed, meant you couldn't go back to normal life. You couldn't pretend the world was what you'd always been told it was. You became a threat to the biggest secret in human history, and people who are threats to secrets this big don't live very long. I should have gotten back in the aircraft right then, tried to take off despite the damaged ski and low fuel, crashed somewhere outside the restricted zone where my death would look like weather or mechanical failure instead of murder. But I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the pilot's instinct to investigate before making decisions. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that I was already dead. The moment those wheels touched ice in Zone Delta 7, my fate was sealed. So I might as well understand what I was dying for. I started walking toward the structures. Stupid decision. Probably suicidal. Definitely against every survival protocol I'd been taught. I had emergency supplies in the aircraft. Food, water, cold weather gear, survival beacon. I should have stayed with the plane, activated the beacon, waited for rescue even if it meant facing questions about why I'd violated restricted airspace. But my feet were moving toward those impossible structures on the horizon, and I couldn't stop them. The ice was rough. Wind sculpted into ridges and hollows that made walking treacherous, and the cold was getting worse as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon. Antarctica in summer has 24-hour daylight, but the sun still moves around the sky, and when it gets low, temperatures drop fast. I figured I had maybe 2 hours before the cold became lethal, even with my flight suit and thermal layers. 2 hours to reach those structures, see what they were, and get back to the aircraft. Except I knew, even as I was calculating the timing, that I wasn't coming back. Not really. Once I saw what was out there, once I understood what they'd been hiding in Zone Delta 7, I would be changed in ways that couldn't be undone. The Dan Foster who climbed out of that aircraft was already gone. The person who would walk back, if anyone walked back, would be someone different, someone who knew too much and wouldn't survive long because of it. The structures grew larger as I walked, revealing details that made them even more impossible. The surfaces weren't smooth. They were covered in patterns that might have been writing or circuitry or some combination of both. Symbols that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them from different angles. The materials looked old, weathered by time and ice, but also somehow pristine, like they were resistant to the normal processes of decay. And the geometry was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Angles that didn't quite make sense to human vision. Proportions that were too perfect or too distorted depending on perspective. About halfway to the structures, I found something that made me stop walking and just stand there in the freezing wind trying to process what I was seeing. There was a path, cleared of ice and snow, leading from where I'd landed directly to the structures. Not a natural formation, a cleared path, like someone had known exactly where my aircraft would touch down and had prepared a route for me to follow. The ice on either side was rough and uneven, but this path was smooth, almost glassy, and when I stepped on it, my boots gripped better than they had on the natural ice. Someone or something had prepared this path, recently, for me. And that's when I knew for absolute certain that everything that had happened, the storm, the interference, the forced landing, wasn't accident or coincidence. I had been brought here deliberately, guided to this specific location, and whatever was in those structures ahead of me had been expecting my arrival. The closer I got to the structures, the more wrong they became. I'm trying to describe this accurately, but human language wasn't designed for what I was seeing. The structures were emerging from the ice, not built on top of it, but coming up through it, like they'd been buried for a long time and were only partially exposed. The exposed sections rose maybe 40 or 50 feet above the ice surface, but you could see where they continued down into the glacier. Shadows and shapes visible through the translucent ice, suggesting that what I was looking at was just the tip of something much, much larger. The metal, and I'm calling it metal because I don't have a better word, but it wasn't like any metal I'd ever seen, had this dark, almost black surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. except occasionally, when the angle was right, it would catch sunlight and throw it back in colors that shouldn't exist. Wavelengths that made my eyes water and left afterimages burned into my vision. Standing in front of those structures, I felt like I was looking at something that existed in more dimensions than the three I could perceive, like my brain was only processing a fraction of what was actually there. The architecture was what really broke my ability to rationalize what I was seeing. Human buildings have specific proportions because we're built to specific proportions. Doors are about 7 feet tall because humans are generally under 7 feet tall. Stairs are specific heights because human legs are specific lengths. Corridors are specific widths because human shoulders are specific widths. But these structures followed none of those rules. The openings, I'm going to call them doorways even though that's not quite right, were huge, maybe 20 feet tall and 12 feet wide. And they had these irregular shapes that weren't quite rectangular, weren't quite arched, but something in between that made your eyes slide off them if you tried to focus too long. The surfaces were covered in those symbols I'd noticed from a distance, and up close they were even more disturbing. They looked carved or etched into the material, but they had depth to them that changed depending on viewing angle, like they existed in 3 dimensions or maybe 4, and they weren't static. I swear to God they weren't static. When I looked away and then looked back, the symbols would be slightly different, rearranged, as if they were responding to observation or maybe just cycling through some pattern I couldn't understand. I reached out to touch the surface, and that was a mistake. The material was cold, colder than the ice around it, colder than anything I'd ever touched, cold enough that I felt it through my gloves like I wasn't wearing any protection at all. But beyond the temperature, there was something else. A kind of vibration or resonance that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. A frequency just below or maybe above human hearing range that made my teeth ache and my skull feel like it was full of pressure. I pulled my hand back fast, and for a few seconds after breaking contact, I could still feel that vibration, like it had somehow gotten inside me and was resonating with my nervous system. Later, much later, when I was trying to make sense of everything, I wondered if that material was some kind of exotic matter that didn't follow normal thermodynamic rules, or maybe technology so advanced that the distinction between matter and energy didn't apply the same way. But standing there in front of it, all I could think was that humans didn't make this, couldn't have made this, and whatever did make it was operating on principles of engineering and physics that we didn't understand. The symbols were the most unsettling part because they suggested communication, intelligence, but not human intelligence. I've seen ancient writing systems before, cuneiform, hieroglyphics, all kinds of historical scripts. And even when you can't read them, you can tell they were made by human hands and human minds. They have symmetry and repetition patterns that reflect how human brains organize information. These symbols didn't have any of that. They were too complex, with layers of meaning embedded in ways that seemed to use dimensionality as part of the information structure. Some symbols were clearly primary, larger, and more prominent, but they were surrounded by smaller marks that seemed to modify or expand the meaning, except the smaller marks also had their own smaller marks, creating this recursive pattern that went down several levels before becoming too small to distinguish. It was like looking at a written language where every word also contained its own grammar rules, its own pronunciation guide, its own etymology, all compressed into a single symbol. My brain hurt trying to follow the patterns, and I realized that whoever created this language had cognitive structures fundamentally different from humans, brains or processors that could handle exponentially more parallel information processing than we're capable of. There was an entrance, or at least an opening that led inside, and the fact that it was accessible, not sealed or frozen shut, suggested that someone or something had used it recently. The ice around the entrance had been cleared away, revealing more of the structure's surface, and there were no snowdrifts or frost accumulation that you'd expect if the opening had been exposed to Antarctic conditions for any length of time. Someone had cleared this within the last few days, maybe hours. As I stood at the threshold, looking into darkness that seemed absolute despite it being full daylight outside, I had to make a decision. Walk inside and see what was there, or turn back to the aircraft and try to survive until rescue arrived, knowing that rescue would probably involve a bullet or a convenient accident. The smart choice was to walk away. The smart choice was to preserve my life for however many hours or days I had left before they found me. But standing there, looking into that darkness, I knew that if I walked away, I'd spend the rest of my short life wondering what was inside. I'd die without understanding what I was being killed to hide. And somehow, that seemed worse than dying with knowledge. I stepped through the entrance, and the darkness wasn't as absolute as it had looked from outside. There was illumination coming from somewhere. Not lights exactly, but a kind of ambient glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Faint, but enough to see by once my eyes adjusted. The corridor beyond was massive, maybe 30 feet wide and equally tall, extending forward into the structure further than my eyes could track. The walls had the same symbol-covered surface as the exterior, but here they were arranged in panels that seemed to pulse very faintly with that same below-hearing vibration I'd felt outside. The floor was smooth, so smooth that my boots barely made any sound, and it sloped downward at a gentle angle, leading deeper into the ice, deeper underground. The air was warmer inside than outside. Not warm, but maybe 0 degrees instead of -20, and it smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, but not like any air I'd breathed before. Sterile and ancient at the same time, if that makes any sense. Like it had been sealed away for thousands of years but was somehow still fresh, still breathable. I took a few careful breaths, waiting to see if I'd suddenly pass out from lack of oxygen or poisonous gases. But I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. The headache I'd had since the emergency landing was fading, and that constant low-level anxiety that had been with me since entering Zone Delta 7 was not gone, but different. Like my body knew on some level that this place wasn't hostile, wasn't dangerous, was just other. I walked down that corridor for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the passage sloping steadily downward, taking me deeper into the ice and deeper into whatever this installation was. The symbols on the walls changed as I progressed, becoming more complex, more layered, like I was moving through different sections or levels of information. And then the corridor opened into something that I still don't have adequate words to describe. A chamber, a hall, a space so vast that I couldn't see the far walls or ceiling, lit by that same ambient glow but stronger here, almost like twilight rather than darkness. And the space was filled with things, structures within the structure, shapes that might have been furniture or equipment or art or all three at once, arranged in patterns that suggested purpose and organization, but not human purpose or human organization. I stood at the entrance to that chamber, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I'd ever felt in my life, and understood that I'd found what they'd been hiding in Zone Delta 7 for all these years. This was why pilots who entered restricted zones died in accidents. This was why the Antarctic Treaty was really written. This was why governments from around the world had cooperated on keeping this secret when they couldn't cooperate on anything else. Because this installation, this structure, this proof of non-human intelligence on Earth, it changed everything. And some secrets are too big, too fundamental, too threatening to the established order to ever let become public knowledge. I was standing in the middle of the biggest secret in human history, and I was absolutely certain that I wasn't getting out of Antarctica alive. I need you to understand something about that moment when I stepped fully into the chamber. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Wasn't really thinking at all in the analytical way a pilot is trained to think. My brain had moved past rational assessment into something closer to sensory overload, just trying to process input without organizing it into coherent understanding. The space was wrong in ways that violated basic geometry. The walls curved when they should have been straight, or stayed straight when they should have curved, creating perspectives that made my depth perception useless. I'd take a step, and the distances would feel wrong, like I'd covered more ground than I should have or less, space itself behaving differently than it did outside. And the technology, because it was clearly technology, not just architecture, was everywhere. Devices or machines, or maybe organisms, I honestly couldn't tell, integrated into the walls and floor and ceiling in ways that made them seem like they'd grown there rather than been installed. Some were clearly active, pulsing with that faint light, others dormant or dead, but all of them were clearly functional, clearly designed for purposes I couldn't begin to guess. The closest device to the entrance looked almost like a control panel, if control panels were designed by something that didn't have hands, or maybe didn't experience reality in 3 dimensions. It was a vertical surface about 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, covered in those symbols. But here they were raised rather than etched, standing out from the surface in what looked like buttons or touch interfaces. Except they weren't arranged in any pattern that made sense for human interaction. Some were clustered in groups that overlapped each other. Others were spaced so far apart you'd need arms 10 feet long to use them simultaneously. And still others were positioned at heights that would require you to be either crawling on the ground or floating in the air to access. As I stared at it, trying to understand what it was for, one of the symbols changed color, shifting from that same dark absorption to a faint blue luminescence. Then another symbol lit up, and another, and I realized the panel was responding to my presence, activating systems or displays or communications that had been dormant, which meant 2 things. First, the installation still had power after God knows how many thousands of years buried in ice. And second, it was aware that I was there. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have been terrified. But standing there in that impossible chamber, watching alien technology activate around me, what I felt was closer to awe, mixed with a kind of grief. Because this installation, this proof of non-human intelligence, this evidence that we're not alone in the universe, humans should have discovered this together, as a species, as a moment of shared wonder and transformation. Instead, it had been hidden, kept secret, turned into classified information that most of humanity would never know existed. And I was standing in the middle of that hidden truth, probably the last thing I'd ever see before they killed me to keep it hidden. The grief wasn't for myself. I'd made peace with dying the moment I landed in Zone Delta 7. The grief was for everyone else. For the 7 billion people living their lives with no idea that their understanding of human history and our place in the cosmos was fundamentally wrong. They deserved to know this existed. They deserved to see what I was seeing. But they never would, because secrets this big stay secret through any means necessary. I moved deeper into the chamber, drawn by something I can't explain. Curiosity, maybe, or compulsion, or just the knowledge that I was already committed and might as well see everything before the end came. The technology became denser as I progressed, more complex, more active. There were screens or displays showing information in those incomprehensible symbols, some of them appearing to be star charts or navigation data, others showing what might have been biological or chemical diagrams, but with structures and molecules that didn't match anything in Earth's periodic table. One display was showing what looked like Earth itself from space, but Earth as it must have looked thousands or maybe millions of years ago, continents in different positions, ice coverage different from modern times. I stood in front of that display for several minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing, and realized that whoever built this installation had been here long enough to watch continents drift, ice ages come and go, species evolve and go extinct. This wasn't a recent arrival. This was something ancient, something that had been on Earth longer than human civilization, maybe longer than humans ourselves. The air was getting warmer the deeper I went, not uncomfortable but noticeably warmer, and I realized the installation must generate its own heat, some kind of power source that had been running continuously for geological time periods. That shouldn't be possible. There's no power source we know of that could run for thousands of years without maintenance or fuel. Nuclear reactors need refueling, solar panels degrade, wind turbines require repairs. But whatever was powering this installation followed different rules, used different physics, operated on principles that our science hadn't discovered yet or maybe couldn't discover because we were trying to understand the universe with human-limited perception. I found what might have been a power core in a side chamber off the main hall, a sphere about 15 feet in diameter, suspended somehow in the center of the room with no visible supports, rotating slowly and emitting that same below-hearing vibration I'd felt earlier but stronger, strong enough that I could feel it in my chest like a second heartbeat. The sphere was covered in those symbols, and they were moving, flowing across the surface like liquid, and the whole thing was glowing with a light that seemed to come from inside, from within the material itself. I shouldn't have touched it. I know I shouldn't have touched it, but the compulsion was overwhelming. Like the sphere was calling to me, Or maybe just generating some kind of field that affected human neurology. I reached out, placed my hand on the surface, and the world exploded into information. Not literally exploded. I was still standing in that chamber, hand on the sphere, but my consciousness expanded in ways that human minds aren't designed to handle. I was seeing the installation not as it appeared to human eyes, but as it actually was. A structure that extended through dimensions I couldn't name, connected to networks of similar installations across the solar system and beyond, all of them linked through something that wasn't quite communication and wasn't quite quantum entanglement, but served the same function of instantaneous information transfer across impossible distances. I was seeing Earth's history from the perspective of whatever intelligence built this place, watching humanity evolve from scattered tribes to global civilization in what felt like seconds, seeing how many times we'd almost discovered the installation, and how many times governments and organizations had intervened to keep it secret. And I was seeing why they kept it secret, not just because the technology was beyond our understanding, but because the installation was still operational, still serving its original purpose, still monitoring and protecting and waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. The contact lasted maybe 5 seconds before I pulled my hand away, gasping, my brain struggling to hold on to the flood of information that was already fading like a dream. But some of it stuck, enough to understand that the installation wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. It had been waiting for thousands of years, and it would keep waiting for thousands more if necessary, because time meant something different to whatever intelligence created it. And the protocols established after its discovery, the flight restrictions and security measures and secrecy agreements, they weren't just to hide the installation from public knowledge. They were to prevent anyone from accidentally activating systems that might send a signal, might call back whoever or whatever left this place here, might announce to the galaxy that humans had finally reached a level of development where we were ready for contact. Or maybe not ready, maybe dangerously unready, maybe primitive enough that we'd be seen as a threat or a resource to be controlled. I was standing in the middle of the greatest archaeological discovery in human history, surrounded by technology that could revolutionize everything we knew about physics and engineering and our place in the universe. And I finally understood why they killed pilots who saw this place. Not to protect the secret for its own sake, but to protect humanity from the consequences of that secret becoming known before we were ready to handle it. Whether that justification was right or wrong, whether we'd ever be ready, whether keeping billions of people in ignorance was ethical or necessary, those were questions above my pay grade. But standing there in that ancient chamber, I understood that this wasn't just a conspiracy to hide alien technology. This was a conspiracy to control humanity's first contact with non-human intelligence, to manage that contact from the shadows, and to ensure that when we finally met whoever built this place, we did so on terms that might actually let us survive the encounter. After pulling my hand away from that sphere, I needed a few minutes just to breathe and let my brain settle back into something approaching normal function. My hand was tingling where I'd touched the surface. Not painful, but not comfortable either. Like mild electric shock that wouldn't dissipate. But more than that, my mind felt different. Expanded somehow, like I'd briefly accessed processing capabilities beyond normal human consciousness. And even though the connection was broken, some residual awareness remained. I could still sense the installation around me in ways that had nothing to do with my physical senses. Could feel the flow of energy through systems I couldn't see. Could almost but not quite understand the purpose of devices whose function should have been completely alien to me. It was fading. That expanded awareness was already slipping away like water through my fingers. But for those few minutes standing in that chamber, I understood on some level that humans weren't meant to understand. And the understanding was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Beyond the main chamber, I found corridors that descended deeper into the ice, spiral ramps that curved downward at angles that suggested the installation extended miles below the surface. I'm talking kilometers, not hundreds of feet. The scale was geological rather than architectural. Each level I descended revealed more active systems, more technology that had been operating continuously for time frames that made human history look like a brief flicker. The corridors themselves were incredible. walls that seemed to be single pieces of that strange, not quite metal material extending seamlessly from floor to ceiling without joints or seams, as if the entire structure had been grown or formed in place rather than assembled from components. And the illumination never failed, never dimmed, that same ambient glow coming from everywhere and nowhere, providing perfect visibility without casting shadows. Shadows would have been wrong somehow in those corridors, would have felt like intrusions of normal physics into a space that operated on different principles. I walked down those ramps for what felt like hours, my sense of time distorted by the unchanging environment and the residual effects of touching that sphere. The equipment I passed defied any attempt at categorization. Some pieces were clearly mechanical. I could see moving parts, rotating elements, physical components that served some function in the installation's operation. Others seemed more like electronics, though electronics built on principles that had nothing to do with silicon chips or electrical circuits. And some were neither mechanical nor electronic, but something else entirely. Devices that seemed to manipulate energy or matter or possibly space itself through means I couldn't even begin to guess at. One room I passed contained what looked like a containment field, a sphere of twisted light suspended in midair with something inside it, a sample of some substance or maybe a small artifact I couldn't tell, frozen in stasis by technology that made our most advanced physics look like Stone Age fire starting. Another chamber had what might have been biological equipment, though biological for life forms that didn't use DNA, or maybe didn't have cells in the way Earth organisms do. Everything was still functioning, still operational, maintained by systems that had been running longer than human civilization existed. The star maps were what finally broke through my lingering shock and forced me to really confront what I was seeing. I found a chamber. I'm calling them chambers, even though they weren't really rooms in any human sense, just spaces along the corridor that served specific functions. That was dedicated to what I can only describe as navigation or astronomy. The walls were covered in projections showing stellar positions, planetary orbits, gravitational fields, all of it in three-dimensional display that moved as I watched, showing stellar drift and orbital mechanics in real time or maybe time-lapse. But these weren't maps of our solar system, at least not primarily. There were star charts showing clusters and nebulae that would be visible from Earth, but were clearly being displayed from the perspective of someone interested in interstellar navigation, in traveling between star systems rather than within them. And the detail was incredible. Planets marked around distant stars, notation symbols indicating composition or atmosphere or some other property that mattered to whoever created these maps. This was the work of a spacefaring civilization, a species that traveled between stars as routinely as humans travel between cities, and they'd been to Earth long before humans existed in any recognizable form. One display in particular caught my attention because I recognized what it was showing: Earth's solar system, but Earth in a configuration I'd never seen before. The orbital positions were wrong for current time. The asteroid belt was denser than it is now, and there were objects marked in the outer system that don't exist in modern astronomy. Moons or small planets or maybe artificial structures that were there when this map was created but are gone now, destroyed or moved or hidden by whoever made them. I stood in front of that display, trying to calculate backward, trying to figure out how long ago this map represented, and the numbers I came up with were impossible. Tens of thousands of years minimum, possibly hundreds of thousands. Time periods when anatomically modern humans barely existed and certainly weren't building anything that would last to the present day. This installation had been operating on Earth since before the pyramids, before agriculture, before the last ice age, possibly before humans were humans in any meaningful sense. And it was still here, still functioning, still serving whatever purpose it was designed for all those millennia ago. The deeper I went, the more I found evidence of observation and monitoring. One level had what I can only describe as a surveillance center, though surveillance using methods that went far beyond cameras or satellites. There were displays showing Earth's surface in real time, not video feeds, but something like direct observation through methods that didn't involve light or electromagnetic radiation. I could see cities, weather patterns, ocean currents, all of it updated continuously, even though the installation was buried under kilometers of ice in Antarctica. They, whoever they were, could observe anywhere on Earth from here, had been observing probably for as long as the installation existed. Another section had archives, storage systems containing data in formats I couldn't access, but could sense were massive, probably storing records of Earth's entire history since the installation was built. Everything that had happened on this planet, every major event in geological and biological history, had been recorded and stored here. We weren't alone on Earth. We'd never been alone. There had always been someone watching, documenting, possibly influencing events in ways we'd interpreted as natural when they were actually managed. I found one more thing before I finally admitted to myself that I needed to get back to the aircraft before I froze to death or ran out of time entirely. In a chamber near what I estimated was the 4th or 5th subterranean level, I found what looked like a communication array, technology designed for transmitting signals across interstellar distances. The equipment was dormant, inactive in a way that suggested it had been deliberately shut down rather than broken. But the implication was clear. This installation could send messages to wherever its creators had come from, could call them back, could announce to whatever civilization built this place that something on Earth had changed, that the installation needed attention, or that its monitoring had detected something significant enough to warrant intervention. And this was why Zone Delta 7 was restricted, why pilots who saw this place died in accidents, why governments from around the world had cooperated to keep it secret. Because if someone activated that communication array, if someone sent a signal announcing humanity's presence at a level of technological development that might be interesting or threatening, we had no idea what would come back. Would it be peaceful first contact with advanced beneficent aliens? Would it be conquerors coming to reclaim a monitoring station they'd abandoned millennia ago? Would it be something so alien to human understanding that we couldn't even recognize it as life or intelligence? Nobody knew, and the people who discovered this installation had decided that not knowing was preferable to finding out. As I stood in front of that dormant communication array, I understood the weight of responsibility that governments had been carrying since they discovered this place. This wasn't just a cool archaeological find or advanced technology to reverse engineer. This was a loaded gun pointed at Earth's entire future, and the safety was off, and all it would take was one person curious enough or desperate enough or stupid enough to start pressing buttons and trying to make contact. The flight restrictions, the security measures, the willingness to kill to protect the secret, all of it made a sick kind of sense when you understood what was at stake. They weren't keeping this secret to maintain power or control technology or any of the usual conspiracy reasons. They were keeping it secret because humanity wasn't ready for what would happen if we announced our presence to whoever built this place. Maybe we'd never be ready. Maybe that readiness wasn't something a species could achieve. Maybe first contact with truly advanced alien intelligence was inherently catastrophic regardless of preparation. But standing there in that chamber, looking at technology that could bridge the stars and bring something back to Earth that would change everything we are, I realized that the conspiracy to hide this installation wasn't the greatest crime against humanity. The greatest crime would be revealing it too soon, activating that communication array before we had any chance of surviving what came after, and dooming our entire species because one person thought they had a right to know the truth. I don't know how long I spent inside that installation. Time felt distorted down there, like the normal flow of seconds and minutes didn't apply the same way. Could have been 2 hours, could have been 5. But when I finally made my way back to the surface, back through those impossible corridors and up those spiral ramps, emerging into the Antarctic daylight that hurt my eyes after the ambient glow of the interior, I immediately knew something was wrong. The wind had picked up. That much was normal. But there was another sound underneath it, a rhythmic thumping that I recognized instantly from my military training. Helicopter rotors. Multiple helicopters, incoming fast. I looked toward my aircraft, still sitting where I'd left it about 6 kilometers away, and saw them on the horizon. 3 black helicopters in tight formation, military grade from their profile, heading directly toward my position. They weren't search and rescue. Search and rescue doesn't travel in formation like that, doesn't use military aircraft, and definitely doesn't arrive less than 2 hours after an emergency landing in the most remote part of Antarctica. This was a recovery team, and they'd known exactly where to find me. The math didn't work. Even if McMurdo had tracked my position when I deviated from my flight path, Even if they'd immediately dispatched rescue, the flight time from McMurdo to my location should have been at least 3 hours, probably closer to 4 given the distance and weather conditions. But I'd been inside the installation for maybe 2 hours maximum, which meant these helicopters had launched before I'd even landed, possibly before I'd even entered Zone Delta 7. They'd known I was coming here. They'd been waiting for this to happen, had recovery teams on standby, ready to move the moment a pilot violated the restricted zone. Or maybe, and this thought made my blood run cold, maybe they'd been tracking me specifically, had known I was asking questions and getting too curious, and had used that storm to force me here deliberately. Maybe I wasn't an accidental intruder who'd stumbled onto their secret. Maybe I was a test case, someone they'd decided to expose to the truth in a controlled way to see how I'd react, what I'd do with the knowledge. Either way, my time as a free man was over. I ran. Stupid, pointless, but I ran anyway, sprinting across the ice back toward my aircraft even though I knew I'd never reach it before they intercepted me. My lungs burned in the cold air. My legs struggled for traction on the uneven surface, and behind me I could hear the helicopters getting closer, the rotor wash becoming a physical pressure in the air. One of them broke formation, swinging wide to cut off my route to the aircraft, and I watched it land between me and my only escape, soldiers in cold weather gear deploying before the skids even touched ice. They moved with the precision of special operations personnel, not regular military, spreading out to create a perimeter that I couldn't possibly break through. I stopped running about 50 meters from the helicopter, hands raised in a gesture that was half surrender and half exhaustion, gasping for breath in air that felt like knives in my throat. 2 soldiers approached with weapons ready, not pointed at me, but ready, and one of them spoke through a radio headset I couldn't hear the other side of. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't offer medical assistance or warm blankets or any of the things normal rescue personnel would provide. They secured me. That's the only word for it. Secured me like I was a hostile contact, patting me down for weapons, checking my pockets, taking my radio and emergency beacon and anything else that could communicate or record. One of them found the camera in my flight suit pocket, a personal camera I'd been carrying since I arrived in Antarctica, just for scenic photos, and immediately removed the memory card before handing the empty camera back to me like it was contaminated. "Captain Foster," the lead soldier said, and his voice was professional but completely devoid of warmth or empathy. "You are under temporary protective custody for unauthorized entry into a restricted research area. You will board the helicopter. You will not attempt to communicate with anyone outside this operation, and you will comply with all instructions until you are properly debriefed. Do you understand? Not, 'Are you injured?' Not, 'We're here to rescue you.' Not even, 'You're in trouble.' Just sterile, scripted phrases that made it clear I was a problem to be contained, not a person to be helped. The helicopter ride back was maybe 40 minutes, but they didn't take me to McMurdo. We flew in the opposite direction, away from the main base, toward coordinates I didn't recognize. The interior of the helicopter was too loud for conversation, but I could see the other soldiers exchanging glances that confirmed what I already knew. They'd done this before, had recovered other pilots who'd seen what they weren't supposed to see, knew the procedures for handling someone who'd been exposed to Zone Delta 7. One of them kept watching me with an expression that might have been pity or might have been assessment, calculating whether I was going to be cooperative or difficult, whether I'd accept whatever was about to happen, or if I'd need to be handled more firmly. I stared out the window, watching the ice sheet pass below us, and tried to memorize everything I'd seen inside that installation, because I knew they were going to try to take it away from me. Debriefing, they'd called it. But I knew from Rodriguez's fate, from ICE's warnings, from the pattern of dead pilots over the years, that debriefing was probably just a polite term for making sure I never talked about what I'd discovered. We landed at a facility I'd never seen before, not on any maps I'd studied, not mentioned in any briefings I'd received. It was built into the ice itself, most of it underground, just a few surface structures and landing pads visible from the air. The soldiers escorted me inside, through security checkpoints that required biometric verification from them, but not from me, as if I was cargo rather than personnel. The interior was clinical, sterile, nothing like the casual scientific atmosphere of McMurdo. This was a military intelligence facility, or something close to it, designed for operations that required absolute security and complete deniability. They took me to a room that was part interrogation chamber and part medical facility, told me to sit, told me to wait, and left me alone for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. Time to think. Time to understand that I was completely isolated, completely at their mercy, completely dependent on their willingness to let me leave this facility alive. When the door finally opened, it wasn't a soldier who entered. It was Dr. Coleman, the same civilian contractor who'd recruited me back in Colorado Springs, the same man who'd briefed us on maintaining discretion, the same pale gray eyes that had never seemed quite human. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between disappointment and resignation, and sat down across from me without introducing himself, without pretending we hadn't met before. "Captain Foster," he said quietly, and his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd had this exact conversation many times before. "You saw something today that you weren't supposed to see, something that officially doesn't exist, in a place that officially isn't there. And now we have to decide what to do with you." He paused, studying my face like he was reading data from sensors I couldn't see. "The easy path, the path most people in your situation choose, is to accept that what you saw was a classified installation, sign additional non-disclosure agreements, accept a medical retirement with full benefits, and never speak about this to anyone. The alternative—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we both knew what the alternative was. Rodriguez crashing into the ice. Chen and Mitchell disappearing. ICE's warning about pilots who violated restricted zones. The alternative was death dressed up as accident, and Coleman was giving me a chance to choose the illusion of survival instead. Coleman didn't wait for my answer. He stood up, gestured to the door, and said, "Come with me. There are people who want to speak with you before any decisions are made." They took me deeper into the facility, through corridors that reminded me uncomfortably of the installation I'd just left. Not in appearance, these were clearly human construction, but in purpose. Everything designed for security, for containment, for keeping secrets that couldn't be allowed to escape. We ended up in a conference room that looked like it belonged in a corporate headquarters or government office building, completely at odds with being buried under Antarctic ice. There was a long table, comfortable chairs, screens on the walls showing maps and data I couldn't read from the doorway. And sitting around that table were 8 people in various uniforms and civilian attire who all turned to look at me when I entered. I recognized American military insignia on 2 of them, but the others wore uniforms I didn't immediately recognize. Different nations, different flags, different chains of command, but all gathered here for the same purpose: to decide what to do with me. A woman in a British Royal Navy uniform spoke first. "Captain Foster, my name is Commander Patricia Walsh. What you're about to hear is classified at levels that supersede anything in your previous security clearance. You are here because you have been exposed to information that cannot be allowed to become public knowledge, and we need to assess whether you can be trusted with that information or whether alternative measures will be necessary." The threat was implicit but clear. She gestured to the others around the table. "This is an emergency session of the Antarctic Treaty Oversight Committee, a group that officially doesn't exist, but has been managing the situation in Zone Delta 7 since its discovery in 1959. We represent the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, China, Australia, Norway, France and Chile, the primary signatories of the original Antarctic Treaty and the only nations with full knowledge of what that treaty actually protects." She paused, studying my reaction. "You entered an installation that we've been monitoring and protecting for 66 years. We need to know exactly what you saw, exactly what you experienced, and exactly what you're planning to do with that knowledge." The interrogation lasted hours. They asked detailed questions about every moment from when I entered restricted airspace to when the recovery team found me, taking notes on devices that were probably recording and analyzing everything from my word choice to my physiological responses. They wanted to know what areas of the installation I'd accessed, what technology I'd interacted with, whether I'd activated any systems or triggered any alerts. When I described touching the sphere in the power chamber, the room went absolutely silent, and I saw several of them exchange looks that mixed concern with something that might have been fear. "You had direct contact with the core systems?" a Russian officer asked, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. Did you experience any cognitive effects, expanded awareness, access to information that wasn't presented through normal sensory channels? When I confirmed that yes, I'd experienced exactly that, the room's tension increased noticeably. Then you understand, he said quietly, why we cannot allow this knowledge to spread. You've been exposed not just to evidence of non-human intelligence, but to technology that can alter human consciousness, that can provide access to information spanning millennia. If that capability became public knowledge, they didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. If people knew that touching alien technology could expand human consciousness, could provide access to historical records spanning geological time periods, could potentially elevate human understanding to levels we'd never achieved on our own, everyone would want access. Governments would fall over each other trying to control it. Corporations would try to monetize it. Religious groups would either worship it or try to destroy it. And in the chaos of competing interests, someone would inevitably activate systems that we didn't understand and couldn't control, like that communication array. The one that could call back whoever built the installation, announcing humanity's presence to intelligences that might see us as threats or resources or curiosities to be studied and discarded. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, Commander Walsh explained, pulling up documents on the screens, is publicly presented as an agreement for peaceful scientific cooperation and environmental protection. That's true as far as it goes. But the real purpose, the classified purpose, was establishing protocols for managing the installation in Zone Delta 7 after its accidental discovery by a Soviet research expedition. The story she told was simultaneously mundane and terrifying in its implications. In 1958, a Soviet geological survey team had detected magnetic anomalies in the region that would become Zone Delta 7. They'd investigated, drilled through the ice and found, well, they'd found what I'd found. An installation that shouldn't exist. Technology that defied understanding. Proof that Earth had been visited and monitored by non-human intelligence for thousands of years. The Soviets, terrified by the implications and the potential for the discovery to trigger conflicts they couldn't control, had immediately contacted the Americans, the British, and other nations with Antarctic research programs. Not out of altruism, but out of mutual self-preservation. Because if any one nation tried to claim the installation, tried to monopolize the technology, it would have triggered World War III. And if they'd made the discovery public, the resulting social, religious, and political upheaval would have destabilized civilization itself. So they'd done the only rational thing they could think of. They'd agreed to keep it secret, established the Antarctic Treaty as cover for joint management, and created a multinational oversight committee to ensure no single nation gained advantage and no unauthorized personnel got close enough to discover the truth. For 66 years, a Chinese official whose name I didn't catch said, "We have maintained this secret. Through the Cold War, through multiple conflicts between our nations, through periods when cooperation on anything else would have been impossible, we have worked together to protect humanity from knowledge it isn't ready to possess. We've developed protocols for managing the installation, for preventing activation of its communication systems, for intercepting any attempts at contact that might originate from the installation itself. We've sacrificed personnel who got too close. We've redirected scientific research that might have led to independent discovery. We've maintained flight restrictions and exclusion zones that have no public justification. All of it to prevent what you almost caused today." He leaned forward and his expression was utterly serious. "You touched the core systems, Captain Foster. You initiated contact protocols that haven't been activated since we first discovered the installation. For approximately 30 seconds, that installation was broadcasting a signal we couldn't block, announcing to anyone listening that human consciousness had achieved sufficient development to interface with their technology. We don't know if anyone received that signal. We don't know if it will trigger a response. But if it does, if something comes to investigate why the installation activated after 66 years of dormancy, the consequences could be catastrophic." The weight of what he was saying hit me like physical pressure. I hadn't just discovered a secret. I'd potentially activated a beacon that could bring alien attention to Earth, could trigger the first contact scenario that these people had been desperately trying to prevent for nearly 7 decades. And they were right to try to prevent it, because we had no idea what would happen if the installation's creators returned. Would they be benevolent, hostile, indifferent? Would they see humanity as ready for contact, or as primitive primates who'd stumbled onto technology we didn't understand and needed to be controlled or eliminated for our own safety? This is why pilots who violate the restricted zones don't survive, Coleman said, and his voice carried no apology or guilt, just statement of fact. This is why Rodriguez died, why Chen and Mitchell disappeared, why Ice keeps his mouth shut despite knowing more than he should. Because every person who sees the installation becomes a potential security breach, a possible catalyst for exposure that could trigger consequences none of us can control. We can't take that risk. We can't allow even one person to leave with this knowledge if there's any chance they'll talk, any chance they'll try to reveal what they've seen. An Australian officer, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. "Captain Foster, what happens next depends entirely on you. We need to know if you can live with this knowledge, if you can accept that what you saw must remain secret for reasons that transcend national interest or personal rights. We need to know if you understand that the alternative to cooperation is permanent silence, and we need to know it now." She pulled out a document, slid it across the table toward me. "This is a classified service agreement. It commits you to absolute secrecy about everything you've seen, requires you to undergo regular psychological evaluation to ensure compliance, and specifies penalties for breach of security that include life imprisonment and, if circumstances warrant, termination with extreme prejudice. It's not a choice we're happy to offer, but it's the only choice we can offer given what you know." Around the table, 8 representatives of 8 different nations all watched me, waiting to see whether I'd sign away my freedom to talk about the most significant discovery in human history, or whether I'd refuse and force them to make me disappear like all the others who'd refused before me. I looked at that document, at the signatures and seals from governments that usually couldn't agree on anything but had agreed on this. I thought about Rodriguez, about his family probably still believing his death was a tragic accident rather than murder. I thought about all the people who died to protect this secret, and all the billions of people living their lives with no idea that everything they believed about humanity's place in the universe was wrong. And I thought about that communication array, about the signal I'd potentially activated, about the possibility that something was already on its way to Earth in response to 30 seconds of contact with human consciousness. "I'll sign," I said finally, because what choice did I have? But even as I was reaching for the pen, even as I was agreeing to keep their secret, I knew it was a lie. I knew that someday, somehow, I'd find a way to tell people what I'd seen, because some truths are too important to keep hidden, regardless of the consequences. But for now, in that conference room, surrounded by people who'd proven they were willing to kill to protect this secret, I signed. I agreed to their terms, and I began planning my escape. After I signed the document, my signature shaking slightly because my hand wouldn't stay steady, whether from cold or fear or anger I couldn't tell, Commander Walsh pulled up more files on the screens, documents marked with classification levels I'd never seen before. "You're entitled to know what you're protecting," she said, which was generous considering I was entitled to exactly nothing except maybe a bullet if I stepped out of line. "The full history of the installation, the real purpose of the Antarctic Treaty, and the programs we've been running for the past 66 years. What she showed me over the next 2 hours fundamentally changed my understanding of modern history and humanity's technological development. Everything I'd thought I knew about the 20th century, the space race, the Cold War, the technological explosion that gave us computers and satellites and modern communications, all of it was connected to that installation buried in the ice, all of it influenced by technology we'd been secretly studying and reverse engineering since 1959. The discovery happened in March 1959, during the International Geophysical Year that had brought scientists from multiple nations to Antarctica for coordinated research. A Soviet team led by a geologist named Viktor Petrov, who mysteriously died in a climbing accident 6 months later, had been surveying magnetic anomalies in the region when their instruments detected something that shouldn't exist. A massive electromagnetic signature coming from deep beneath the ice, pulsing with a regularity that suggested artificial origin rather than natural phenomena. They'd radioed their findings to the main Soviet base, but the transmission had been intercepted by American and British monitoring stations, because of course everyone was spying on everyone else even during supposedly cooperative scientific research. Within 48 hours, teams from the USSR, USA, and UK were all heading toward the same coordinates, each nation hoping to claim whatever was down there before their rivals arrived. The potential for conflict was enormous, the Russian officer explained, pulling up historical weather data and expedition logs. We were on the brink of armed confrontation in Antarctica, which would have violated the very spirit of scientific cooperation we were publicly promoting. But when the first team broke through to the installation, when they saw what was actually there, everything changed. What they found terrified them more than any potential military conflict. The installation was obviously non-human, obviously ancient, and obviously still operational, generating power, maintaining systems, monitoring Earth in ways they couldn't fully understand. The immediate question wasn't which nation would control it, but whether humanity could control it at all, whether we were even capable of safely interacting with technology that advanced without triggering catastrophic consequences. The decision to cooperate wasn't altruistic, Commander Walsh said bluntly. It was survival instinct. Everyone recognized that trying to claim the installation unilaterally would trigger wars we couldn't afford, and trying to study it without proper containment might activate systems we didn't understand. So the major powers made a deal: pool resources, share knowledge, maintain absolute secrecy, and prevent any single nation from gaining monopolistic advantage. By December 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed by 12 nations, establishing Antarctica as a scientific preserve dedicated to peaceful research. The public version of the treaty focused on environmental protection and demilitarization. The classified annexes, the parts that were never published, never discussed in international forums, established protocols for managing the installation, sharing research findings, and most importantly, preventing any public disclosure of its existence. The reverse engineering program was more extensive and more successful than I'd imagined. We've been studying that technology for 6 decades, Coleman said, and there was something like pride in his voice, mixed with fear. Not successfully, not completely, but we've learned enough to advance human technology by decades or possibly centuries beyond what we would have achieved on our own. He pulled up images showing technological developments from the 1960s onward: integrated circuits, satellite communications, advanced materials science, fiber optics, GPS navigation, even some aspects of computer processing. Not all of this came from the installation directly, but all of it was influenced by principles we observed there. We couldn't replicate their technology. We didn't have the materials, the understanding, the mathematical frameworks, but we could see what was possible, could understand the directions that physics and engineering might take if pushed beyond conventional limitations. The space race apparently had been partially motivated by installation research. Soviet and American scientists working independently on their country's space programs, both secretly informed by observations of propulsion systems in the Antarctic installation that suggested methods of overcoming Earth's gravity that we couldn't replicate but could inspire. But the reverse engineering came with costs and ethical compromises that Walsh and the others detailed with uncomfortable clinical precision. Research teams working in the installation had accident rates far higher than conventional scientific programs, people who'd gotten too close to active systems and suffered neurological damage, physiological changes, or in several cases simply disappeared without trace or explanation. 17 researchers dead over the decades, Walsh said, showing casualty reports that were never filed with any official oversight body. Another 33 with long-term medical complications ranging from seizures to cognitive disorders to genetic mutations that we're still trying to understand. The installation isn't hostile. We don't believe it's designed to harm anyone. But human biology isn't adapted to the energy fields and dimensional properties it generates. Extended exposure has consequences we can't predict or prevent. And beyond the direct casualties were the people like me, pilots and support personnel who'd seen too much and had to be silenced through agreements like the one I'd just signed or through more permanent measures when agreements weren't sufficient. The program had given humanity technological advantages that shaped the modern world, but it had also created a permanent underground government that operated outside democratic oversight or public accountability. There are facilities in 7 countries, the Chinese official explained, where research derived from the installation continues under classification so deep that most government leaders don't know they exist. Black budget programs funding research that can never be published, scientific discoveries that can never be shared, technologies that will be slowly released to the public over decades or centuries to maintain the illusion of natural human progress. He pulled up organizational charts showing networks that connected military contractors, private corporations, and government agencies in structures that transcended national boundaries. The committee you're speaking with represents the top level of oversight, but below us are thousands of personnel working on projects they only partially understand, contributing to reverse engineering efforts without knowing the source of what they're studying. It's necessary compartmentalization. The more people who know the full truth, the greater the risk of exposure. The question I couldn't stop asking was why? Why hide this from humanity? Why maintain the secret for 66 years when disclosure could have united the species around a common revelation, could have accelerated technological development, could have given billions of people a sense of purpose and meaning, knowing we're not alone in the universe? Commander Walsh answered with the kind of brutal honesty that military people sometimes employ when they're tired of justifying difficult decisions. Because disclosure would destroy civilization as we know it, she said flatly. Not immediately, not dramatically, but through slow systemic collapse that would take decades to fully manifest. Religious institutions would fracture. How do you maintain faith traditions built on human exceptionalism when faced with evidence of older, more advanced intelligences? Economic systems would destabilize. Why maintain current power structures when alien technology could provide free energy, eliminate scarcity, render most human labor obsolete? Political legitimacy would evaporate. What government maintains authority when people realize they've been lied to about humanity's place in the cosmos for generations? She pulled up sociological studies, classified research into potential disclosure scenarios, all of them showing the same conclusion, revealing the installation would trigger social, economic, and political upheaval that most societies couldn't survive intact. So we made a choice, Coleman said, and his voice carried the weight of decades spent living with that choice. We decided that humanity's stability was worth more than humanity's right to know the truth. We decided that controlled technological advancement was safer than revolutionary transformation. We decided that protecting people from knowledge they couldn't handle was more important than respecting their autonomy to make informed decisions about their own species' future. He looked at me directly, those pale gray eyes showing something that might have been guilt or might have been conviction. It's not a decision we made lightly, Foster. It's not a decision we're proud of. But it's the decision we made, and for 66 years it's kept humanity from tearing itself apart over knowledge we're not ready to process. You can judge us for that. You probably should judge us for that. But before you do, consider what would happen tomorrow if we announce the truth. Consider the panic, the conflict, the collapse of every institution people depend on for stability and meaning. Consider whether your right to know is worth billions of other people's right to live in a functioning society. And sitting there in that conference room, looking at evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped the modern world, I had to admit I didn't have a good answer. I didn't know if they were right, but I knew they believed they were right. And that belief had been strong enough to maintain a secret for nearly 7 decades, through wars and crises and technological revolutions that should have made the secret impossible to keep. And somehow, impossibly, they'd succeeded. They kept me at that underground facility for 3 days, running psychological evaluations, medical tests, more debriefings that felt like interrogations, disguised as concern for my well-being. They were professional about it. No threats, no violence, just constant monitoring and assessment to determine whether I was really going to keep their secret or whether I'd become a problem that needed permanent resolution. I played along, gave them all the right answers, acted traumatized and compliant and grateful to be alive. But the whole time, I was watching, learning the facility's routines, identifying weaknesses in their security protocols. Because on day 2, during one of my sessions with the base psychologist, I overheard something that confirmed what I'd already suspected. They weren't planning to let me leave. Subject shows acceptable compliance indicators, the psychologist was saying to someone outside my hearing, her voice carrying through a partially open door. But integration probability assessment remains below threshold. Recommend extended observation followed by permanent isolation protocols if necessary. Permanent isolation protocols. That was military bureaucracy speak for making me disappear. The transfer happened on day 4. They told me I was being moved to a rehabilitation facility in New Zealand, somewhere I could decompress and adjust to civilian life before my medical retirement became official. Sounded reasonable, sounded humane, sounded exactly like the kind of thing they'd say before putting me on a transport that would develop mysterious mechanical problems over the Southern Ocean. They gave me back my personal effects, wallet, watch, even the camera they'd confiscated, though the memory card was obviously gone, and escorted me to a small airfield on the surface where a civilian aircraft was waiting. Not military transport, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. They were maintaining deniability, using contractors who couldn't be traced back to government operations. The pilot and co-pilot wore civilian clothes, carried no identification, and had that particular emptiness in their eyes that you see in people who've done wet work, who've solved human problems with permanent solutions, and stopped losing sleep over it years ago. I waited until we were airborne, about 20 minutes into the flight, before making my move. The aircraft was small, just 6 seats, including the cockpit, and they'd seated me in the back with one security escort, a younger guy who'd been polite enough during my detention, but who kept his hand near his sidearm in a way that suggested he knew exactly what this flight was really about. I'd been watching him for 3 days, learning his habits, and I knew his weakness. He was too confident, too certain that a traumatized pilot who just signed away his freedom wasn't a threat. When he got up to use the small bathroom in the rear of the aircraft, I followed him back, claimed I was feeling airsick from the turbulence. The moment he turned away to grab a sickness bag from the compartment, I hit him with everything I'd learned in close quarters combat training, using the narrow space to my advantage. He went down hard, hit his head on the bulkhead, and by the time he'd recovered enough to realize what was happening, I had his weapon and his radio. The pilot and co-pilot were a bigger problem. I couldn't fly this aircraft alone. I was a cargo pilot, not rated for this specific model, and even if I had been, I couldn't navigate to anywhere useful without them noticing and intervening. But I could make them think I was unstable enough to do something suicidal, which gave me leverage. I moved to the cockpit, weapon visible but not pointed at anyone, and said very calmly, "I need you to change course. Take me to Christchurch International Commercial Airport, somewhere public where you can't make me disappear quietly." The pilot turned, assessed the situation with professional detachment, and said, "Captain Foster, you don't want to do this. Put the weapon down. We can work this out." But his hand was moving towards something under his seat, and I put a round into the instrument panel next to his head to show I was serious. "Christchurch," I repeated, "or the next shot goes somewhere that won't miss." They exchanged looks, ran calculations about whether they could overpower me, and apparently decided that crashing in the Southern Ocean wasn't worth whatever they were being paid. We altered course, but I knew getting to Christchurch alive wasn't enough. The moment we landed, I'd be detained by New Zealand authorities who were probably part of the same network that had been monitoring the Antarctic installation for decades. I needed insurance, needed something that would make killing me more trouble than letting me disappear. Before we'd taken off, when they'd given me back my personal effects, I'd noticed something. The facility's security was focused on preventing unauthorized access to classified information, but they'd been less careful about preventing removal of personal items that seemed innocuous. My camera was empty, but in the pocket of my flight suit was a USB drive I'd been carrying since I arrived in Antarctica. Just personal photos and documents, nothing classified. Except during my 3 days of detention, I'd managed to access a computer terminal during one of my unsupervised bathroom breaks, and I'd copied files. Not many. I'd only had maybe 90 seconds before someone would notice, but enough. Coordinates for the installation. Technical specifications that wouldn't mean anything to most people, but would confirm the story if I ever needed proof. And photographs from internal security systems showing the installation's interior. It wasn't comprehensive evidence. Wasn't enough to prove everything I knew, but it was enough to make me credible. Enough to make my death suspicious if these files suddenly appeared after I disappeared. We landed at Christchurch International about 40 minutes later, the pilot clearly improvising emergency protocols to explain why an unscheduled civilian aircraft was requesting immediate landing clearance. The moment the wheels touched down, I knew I had maybe 5 minutes before security personnel arrived, maybe 10 before someone from the Oversight Committee's local assets showed up to contain the situation. I zip-tied the escort and pilots, used the same plastic restraints they'd probably planned to use on me, grabbed my bag, and ran. The airport was chaos in my favor. Hundreds of travelers, multiple exits, security focused on incoming threats rather than outgoing ones. I made it to the public transportation area, caught a bus headed into the city, paid cash, and started the process of disappearing. Christchurch, Auckland, Sydney, Vancouver, traveling on credit cards I'd kept from my previous life, but abandoning them as soon as I'd moved locations, staying in cash-only accommodations, avoiding any pattern that could be tracked. The first 6 months were the hardest. I was sleeping in hostels, cheap motels, sometimes just in my car when I couldn't risk being seen. Every siren made me think they'd found me. Every stranger who looked at me twice might have been surveillance. I grew a beard, gained weight, changed my appearance as much as possible without surgery. But more than physical safety, I needed to secure the evidence I'd stolen. I made copies, multiple copies, uploaded to servers in countries that didn't cooperate with US intelligence, buried in encrypted folders with dead man's switches that would release them if I didn't check in regularly. I sent copies to people I trusted with instructions to open them, only if I died under suspicious circumstances. It wasn't perfect security, but it was enough to make killing me complicated, enough to make the Oversight Committee think twice before authorizing permanent resolution. And apparently it worked, because I'm still alive 3 years later, living in this cabin in northern Canada, where nobody asks questions and nobody cares about your past, as long as you keep to yourself. But living like this, it's not really living. It's existing in the margins, always watching over your shoulder, always knowing that one mistake could be fatal. I've had no contact with anyone from my old life. My friends think I died in that emergency landing in Antarctica. There was a memorial service, apparently. Very tasteful, very respectful, honoring the sacrifice of a dedicated pilot who'd served his country faithfully. My personnel file lists me as deceased, killed in the line of duty. End of story. The people I served with, the pilots who knew me, they've all moved on, living their lives without knowing that I'm still out here, hiding in the wilderness with knowledge that could change everything they think they understand about the world. And the hardest part is knowing that I can't change anything, can't release the information I have, because the moment I do, the dead man's switches trigger, the evidence goes public, and yeah, maybe people learn the truth about the Antarctic installation, but I also die, probably violently, probably in a way that looks like an accident or suicide or random violence. Because the Oversight Committee has been maintaining this secret for 66 years, and they're not going to let one rogue pilot undo all that work, just because he thinks humanity deserves to know. So I've been living in this stalemate for 3 years. They know roughly where I am. You can't hide completely in the modern surveillance state. But they also know that killing me means the evidence gets released. And I know that releasing the evidence means I die, but also that keeping it hidden means nothing changes, means the secret stays secret, means all those people who died to protect it died for nothing. It's been 3 years of this impossible balance, 3 years of wondering if I made the right choice, 3 years of asking myself whether staying alive with knowledge I can't use is better than dying and forcing the truth into the open. But 3 days ago, I saw that drone. And yesterday, I saw another one. And this morning, I heard helicopters in the distance. They're not just monitoring anymore. They're closing in. Which means either they've decided I'm too much of a risk to leave alive, or something's changed that makes my silence more important than the stalemate we've been maintaining. Either way, my time is running out. Which is why I'm recording this now. Why I'm telling you everything I know. Why I'm breaking the agreement I signed in that conference room 3 years ago. Because if I'm going to die anyway, and I probably am, let's be honest, then I'm going to make sure someone knows what I saw. Someone understands what's buried in that ice. Someone can make an informed decision about whether humanity's right to know is worth the consequences of knowing. Parte 16. Aviso final. Okay, I don't have much time left, so I need to tell you the most important parts quickly. If you've listened this far, if you've heard everything I've said about the installation in Antarctica, about the conspiracy that's been hiding it for 66 years, about the choice between humanity's right to know and humanity's safety, then you need to understand what happens next. The evidence I stole, the files and photographs and coordinates that prove everything I've told you, they're hidden in multiple locations with instructions for release if I don't check in regularly. But I'm going to tell you where some of them are, so that even if the dead man switches fail, even if they find some way to contain the automatic release, there will still be people who know where to look. I'm trusting you with this because I have no other choice, because 3 years of hiding has taught me that secrets this big can't be kept by one person, and because I hear helicopters getting closer, and I don't think I have hours left anymore. Maybe not even minutes. The primary backup is stored on servers in Iceland, a country that's proven resistant to international pressure about data privacy, that doesn't have extradition treaties with the nations involved in the Antarctic Oversight Committee. The server farm is called Nordervarp Data Systems, located outside Reykjavik, and the files are in an encrypted account under the name Viktor Petrov, the Soviet geologist who originally discovered the installation in 1959 and died 6 months later in an accident that probably wasn't an accident. The password is a string of coordinates, 82.4S157.3E, the location where my aircraft landed in Zone Delta 7. If something happens to me, if I stop making my regular check-ins, those files will automatically be distributed to major news organizations, scientific journals, and public forums around the world. But if you're listening to this and the automatic release hasn't happened, if weeks or months have passed and nothing's come out, then someone needs to go to those servers and manually retrieve the data. Inside, you'll find everything. Technical specifications of the installation, photographs from my camera and from facility security systems I accessed, documents from the Oversight Committee showing the scope of the conspiracy, and most importantly, the exact coordinates where the installation can be found. The coordinates are 82 degrees 24 minutes south, 157 degrees 18 minutes east. That's the location in Zone Delta 7, where the installation is partially exposed above the ice sheet, where any properly equipped expedition could verify everything I've told you. It's in one of the most remote regions of Antarctica, more than 300 kilometers from the nearest research station, in an area that's been deliberately excluded from all public mapping and satellite imagery under the justification of environmental protection. But it's there. It's real. And if you have the resources to mount an expedition, if you're a scientist with access to Antarctic research funding, if you're a journalist willing to risk your career and possibly your life, if you're anyone who values truth more than safety, you can go there and see for yourself. The installation won't be hard to find once you're in the area. The electromagnetic signature alone is strong enough to disrupt standard navigation equipment within a 10-kilometer radius. But be warned, the moment you enter that zone, the moment you get close enough to observe the installation, you'll be detected. The Oversight Committee has monitoring systems that track any approach to the restricted areas. They'll know you're there within hours, possibly minutes. And they'll send recovery teams to intercept you before you can document what you've seen. There are secondary backups scattered around the world because I learned early in my fugitive life that you can't trust any single point of failure. There's a safe deposit box in Vancouver under the name Michael Rodriguez, my friend who died in Antarctica, whose name I borrowed to honor his memory, that contains physical copies of the most critical documents. There's another encrypted server in Switzerland, another in Brazil, another in Japan. I won't give you all the locations or access codes because if they're listening to this recording, and they probably are, I don't want to make it too easy for them to clean up all the evidence before it can be distributed. But what I will say is this: if you're serious about verifying what I've told you, if you're willing to risk what verification might cost, start with Iceland. Start with those servers. And if you find the files have been deleted, if you find the automatic release has been blocked, then you'll know for certain that everything I've said is true, because why else would they go to such lengths to hide it? The hardest part about this, about recording this final message, is knowing what it might trigger. If these files get released, if people actually believe what I'm saying and start asking questions, demanding investigations, trying to reach the installation. The Oversight Committee will have to make decisions they've been avoiding for 66 years. They'll have to choose between maintaining the secret through whatever means necessary, potentially using violence on a scale that would make the individual pilot assassinations look trivial, or they'll have to acknowledge the truth and deal with the social upheaval that follows. I don't know which choice is worse. I don't know if I have the right to force that choice on them, on humanity. But I do know that the current situation, billions of people living in ignorance while a small group makes decisions about our species' future without any democratic oversight or public accountability, that can't continue indefinitely. At some point, the truth comes out. It always does. The only question is whether it comes out in a controlled way that might preserve some stability, or in a catastrophic revelation that nobody's prepared for. Wait, I hear it now, getting louder. Definitely helicopters, probably 2 of them based on the rotor sound, coming from the south. They've found me. I knew they would eventually, but I'd hoped for a few more days to finish this properly. I need to wrap this up fast. If you're listening to this, if this recording made it out somehow, then I'm probably dead. They're not coming to negotiate. They're not coming to offer me another chance to keep quiet. 3 years of stalemate is over, and they've decided that whatever risk my dead man's switches represent is worth taking, because the risk of letting me live is greater. Maybe that signal I triggered when I touched the sphere in the installation. Maybe something responded. Maybe something's coming, and they need to ensure absolute security before first contact happens. Or maybe they just decided I'm too unpredictable, too much of a loose end, too likely to eventually break silence regardless of the consequences. Either way, this is it. This is the end of my story. But it doesn't have to be the end of the truth. You have the coordinates now. You have the server locations. You have everything you need to verify that what I've told you isn't just the paranoid delusions of a traumatized pilot hiding in the wilderness. Go to Antarctica. Go to 82 degrees, 24 minutes south, 157 degrees, 18 minutes east. See what's there. Document it. Broadcast it before they can stop you. Or don't if you think maintaining the secret is really protecting humanity from something we can't handle. If you think the Oversight Committee is right and disclosure would cause more harm than good, then let this recording die with me. Let the secret stay secret. I've given you the choice that nobody gave me. The choice between comfortable ignorance and dangerous knowledge. Whatever you decide, whatever happens next, just remember that I tried. I tried to do the right thing, even though I'm still not sure what the right thing actually is. The helicopters are close now, maybe a kilometer away, close enough that I can see them through the trees. Black, unmarked, same type that picked me up in Antarctica 3 years ago. I need to stop recording, need to move. Actually, no. I'm not running anymore. I'm tired of running. I've spent 3 years living like a ghost. 3 years wondering if the next day would be my last. 3 years carrying knowledge I couldn't share and watching the world continue in ignorance of what's really out there. If this is the end, then I'm going to face it standing still, recording until the very last second, making sure that whoever finds this has the complete story. They're landing now. I can hear the rotors winding down, doors opening. Multiple personnel deploying. Professional. Efficient. They've done this before. I hope the automatic systems work. I hope the files get distributed like they're supposed to. I hope someone listens to this and decides that truth matters more than safety, or that safety matters more than truth, or finds some way to balance both that's better than the impossible choice the Oversight Committee has been making for 66 years. But most of all, I hope